Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We are glad you could join us for tonight's descent into the shadows that linger in the most beautiful of places. The great national parks of the world are cathedrals of nature, sanctuaries of serenity and untamed beauty. We seek them out to escape the noise of civilization, to find solace in the rustle of leaves and the vastness of the sky. But this profound isolation, the very quality we cherish, holds a dual nature. It can be a balm for the soul, but it can also be a perfect accomplice to the darkest of human impulses, a place where a scream can be swallowed by the wind and where the wild's indifference is matched only by the coldness of a predator who walks on two legs. Tonight, we journey into these revered landscapes not to admire the view but to uncover the chilling stories of those who went seeking peace and found terror instead. These are the wilderness slayings. Case 1. The Yosemite Park Killer. Yosemite. The name itself evokes images of grandeur, of granite monoliths like El Capitan and half-dome piercing a crystalline blue sky. It is a realm of giant sequoias, ancient beings that have stood silent watch for millennia, and of waterfalls that roar with the power of melted snow. For over a century, Yosemite National Park has been a symbol of American wilderness, a protected haven drawing millions of visitors each year. They come as pilgrims to a natural church, seeking recreation, inspiration, and a connection to something larger than themselves. They arrive with maps and hiking boots, with cameras and camping gear, their hearts full of anticipation for the adventure ahead. They trust in the park's promise of safety and unspoken pact that within these protected boundaries, the dangers are those of a sudden storm, a misstep on a trail, an encounter with wildlife not of man. In February of 1999, this pact was broken in the most brutal way imaginable. The illusion of sanctuary was about to be systematically dismantled, leaving behind a trail of terror that would forever stain the park's pristine image. Our story begins not deep within the park's core, but just outside its western gate, in the small town of El Portal. Here, nestled along the Merced River, sits the Cedar Lodge, a rustic motor inn that serves as a popular base camp for tourists. It was here, on February 12, 1999, that three women checked in, their spirits high. They were Carol Sund, a 42-year-old mother from Eureka, California, her 15-year-old daughter, Julie, and their family friend, 16-year-old Silvina Palazzo, an exchange student from Argentina. Carol was a vibrant, caring woman, the matriarch of a close-knit family. This trip was meant to be a special treat, a mother-daughter bonding experience before Julie, a bright and cheerful teenager, would embark on her own adventures. Silvina, who was living with a different family in Eureka, was invited along to see the wonders of Yosemite, a place she had dreamed of visiting. Her parents back in Cordoba, Argentina, had entrusted their daughter to the American experience, never imagining it would lead her into a nightmare. The trio was a picture of happy anticipation. They had spent the day sightseeing, marveling at the snow-dusted landscape, capturing memories on film. Their plan was simple: spend a few days exploring the park before heading home. On the evening of February 15th, they were due to meet Carol's husband, Jens Sund, in San Francisco. When they failed to appear, Jens wasn't immediately alarmed. Winter weather could be unpredictable in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Perhaps they were delayed by a road closure or had simply decided to extend their stay by a day. But as the hours turned into a day, and then two, with no word, no calls, no sign of his wife, daughter, and their young friend, a quiet unease began to curdle into cold, sharp fear. Jens reported them missing. The initial investigation was treated as a standard missing persons case. The Tuolumne County Sheriff's Office began its work, checking local hospitals and motels, issuing bulletins for their rented red 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix. It was possible they had gotten lost or their car had broken down on a remote road. The park is vast, over 1,200 square miles of rugged terrain. In the winter, many areas are inaccessible, and a simple wrong turn could lead to serious trouble. The families, desperate for answers, organized their own search efforts, plastering missing posters with the smiling faces of the three women across California. The FBI, sensing that this was more than a simple case of lost tourists, soon joined the investigation, bringing their significant resources to bear. The first tangible clue surfaced a few days later, but it only deepened the mystery. Carol Sund's wallet was found lying in a street in Modesto, a city about a 2-hour drive west of Yosemite. It was an unsettling discovery. Why would her wallet be there, so far from the park, while the women and their car were still missing? It suggested they had, at some point, left the Yosemite area, but under what circumstances? Was it a simple robbery? Or was it a marker, a deliberate or accidental breadcrumb on a much darker path? The investigation intensified. The FBI scoured the region, interviewing anyone who might have seen the women or their car. They focused on the Cedar Lodge, their last known location. They spoke to staff and other guests, trying to piece together a timeline. Among the many people they interviewed was a quiet, unassuming handyman who worked at the lodge. His name was Cary Stainer. He was polite, cooperative, and seemingly helpful, offering investigators his thoughts. He blended into the background, just another face in a sea of employees. No one gave him a second thought. He was, after all, the brother of a famous kidnapping victim, Stephen Stainer. The family had already known unimaginable trauma. Surely lightning couldn't strike twice. A month passed. The winter snows began to melt, but the case had grown cold. For the families, it was an agonizing limbo, a daily torture of waiting for a phone call that might bring either relief or ruin. Hope was a flickering candle against a storm of dread. Then, on March 18th, a breakthrough came, but it was the one everyone had feared. A hiker exploring a remote, wooded area off Highway 108 near Long Barn stumbled upon a burned-out vehicle tucked away and hidden from the main road. It was the red Pontiac Grand Prix. The discovery sent a chill through the entire investigation. A car doesn't spontaneously combust in the wilderness. This was an act of deliberate destruction and attempt to erase evidence. Inside the trunk, investigators made a horrific discovery: the charred remains of two bodies. Dental records would later confirm they were Carol Sund and Silvina Palazzo. Both had been strangled. The autopsy on Carol would reveal she had been killed by ligature strangulation, Silvina by manual strangulation. They had been murdered. The discovery was devastating, but it also raised a terrifying question: where was Julie? The search now became a frantic, desperate hunt for a 15-year-old girl who was either being held captive or was already dead, her body discarded somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The FBI and local law enforcement combed the area around Long Barn, a massive, painstaking grid search through dense forest and rugged terrain. The media descended, broadcasting the Sund family's tearful pleas for Julie's safe return. The nation watched, horrified. The image of Yosemite as a peaceful sanctuary was cracking, revealing something ugly and violent beneath. Another week of anguish passed. Then, on March 25th, the final, heartbreaking discovery was made. Julie Sund's body was found near Lake Don Pedro, miles away from where the car was discovered. She had been on her own, a lone victim in a different location. Her throat had been cut. The brutality of the act was staggering. A mother, a daughter, and their friend all murdered, their trip of a lifetime ending in unimaginable violence. The case was now a triple homicide, and the killer, dubbed the Yosemite Park murderer by the press, was a ghost. The FBI had few leads. The crime scenes were challenging. The burnt car had destroyed most physical evidence, and the locations where the bodies were found yielded little. They had a profile of the killer. He was likely someone familiar with the area, someone who could navigate the back roads and remote locations with confidence. He was bold, organized, and ruthless. He was also hiding in plain sight. For 4 months, the case stalled. The investigation continued, but with no new leads, the trail grew colder by the day. The Sund and Palazzo families were left to grieve, to bury their loved ones without knowing who was responsible for their deaths. The fear that had gripped the Yosemite region began to subside into a low, simmering unease. Life, as it does, went on. Summer arrived and new tourists flocked to the park, perhaps with a little more caution, a little more awareness of the shadows, but they came nonetheless. The Cedar Lodge continued to operate, its guests largely unaware that the man who might fix their leaky faucet or faulty air conditioner was a monster. Cary Stainer went back to his life. He worked, he was quiet, he kept to himself. But inside his mind, a storm was raging. He had, by his own later admission, been plagued by violent fantasies since childhood. He harbored a deep-seated rage, particularly towards women. The murders of the Sunds and Palazzo were not a spontaneous act but the culmination of a lifetime of dark desires. And he wasn't finished. The thrill of the triple homicide had been powerful, but the urge, the compulsion, was returning. On July 21, 1999, the ghost struck again. This time, the victim was one of the park's own. Joa Ruth Armstrong was a 26-year-old naturalist who worked with the Yosemite Institute, an educational organization. She was the embodiment of everything the park stood for. She loved nature with a fierce passion and dedicated her life to sharing that love with others, particularly children. She lived in a small, rustic cabin in a remote area of the park called Forsta. It was an isolated spot perfect for someone who felt at home in the wilderness. That evening, a colleague went to check on Joie after she failed to show up for a meeting. What she found was a scene of horror. Joie Armstrong was dead, just yards from her cabin. She had been brutally murdered, decapitated. The ferocity of the attack was shocking, even to seasoned investigators. Unlike the first 3 murders, which had been carried out with a degree of stealth, this one felt different. It was more brazen, more enraged. And this time, the killer made a mistake. The crime scene, though horrific, was fresh. It was within the park's jurisdiction, and the response was immediate and massive. Investigators swarmed the area. They knew this had to be the work of the same killer. The proximity to the first crime's origin point, the nature of the victim alone woman it all fit. Near the scene, an FBI agent noticed tire tracks that seemed out of place. They matched the make and model of a 1979 International Scout, a distinctive vehicle. A park ranger recalled seeing such a vehicle in the area around the time of the murder. A bulletin was issued. The very next day, a camp host at a nudist colony in Wilton, just outside Sacramento, reported seeing the vehicle. He also reported that its driver, a man named Cary Stainer, had been behaving erratically and had confessed to him that he had murdered 4 women. The call electrified the investigation. Suddenly, the faceless handyman from the Cedar Lodge was their prime suspect. The FBI descended on the Laguna del Sol nudist resort. They found Cary Stainer in the cafeteria, calmly eating a meal. He surrendered without a fight. His capture was quiet, almost anticlimactic, a stark contrast to the terror he had unleashed. In custody, the dam of silence broke. Cary Stainer did not just confess, he narrated his crimes in chilling, exhaustive detail. For hours, he spoke to FBI agents in a flat, unemotional voice, recounting the events of February 15th. He told them how he had posed as a maintenance man to gain entry to the women's room at the Cedar Lodge, using the pretense of checking for a leak. Once inside, he brandished a gun. He tied up Carol and Sylvina, then used their own rental car to drive them to a remote location. Julie he kept separate. He held them for a time, a period of terror that can only be imagined. He then strangled Carol. He strangled Sylvina. Later, he took Julie to Lake Don Pedro and cut her throat. He explained how he had returned to the car and set it on fire to destroy evidence. His confession to the murder of Joie Armstrong was just as cold. He said he had been stalking her, watching her cabin for days. He simply walked up to her door, intent on his purpose. When she resisted, he killed her. The beheading, he claimed, was an afterthought, a way to make a statement to see if he could do it. His motive, he claimed, was a lifetime of uncontrollable sexual fantasies and a desire to kill that he could no longer suppress. He spoke of voices in his head, but investigators and psychologists would later argue that this was a convenient excuse, an attempt to build an insanity defense. The truth was likely far simpler and more terrifying. Cary Stainer was a psychopathic sexual sadist who enjoyed inflicting terror and death. The revelations about his background added a disturbing layer to the tragedy. Cary was the older brother of Stephen Stainer, who had been kidnapped at age 7 in 1972 and held captive for 7 years before heroically escaping with another young victim. Stephen's return was a media sensation, a story of survival and heroism that was turned into a book and a TV movie, I Know My Name is Stephen. While Stephen was celebrated as a hero, Cary felt he had become the invisible brother, living in the shadow of a family trauma that wasn't his own. He felt neglected, resentful. Stephen later died in a motorcycle accident in 1989, a tragic end to a tortured life. Cary's defense would later try to argue that this complex family dynamic contributed to his psychological breakdown. But for the prosecution and for the families of his victims, it was no excuse. It was merely a footnote in the biography of a monster. The trial was a formality. With his detailed confession, there was no doubt of his guilt. The only question was his sentence. In 2002, Cary Stainer was convicted of the 4 murders and sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row to this day, an aging man in a small cell, a world away from the vast, open spaces he used as his hunting ground. The Yosemite murders left a permanent scar. For the families of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, Sylvina Palazzo, and Joie Armstrong, it was a wound that would never heal, a loss that defied comprehension. For the National Park Service and the community around Yosemite, it was a brutal awakening. It shattered the cherished belief that these places were separate from the evils of the world. It proved that darkness could find its way into even the most beautiful cathedral of nature, and that the most dangerous predator in the wilderness is, and always has been, man. The case serves as a chilling reminder that the serenity of such places can be a veil, hiding a vulnerability that predators can and do exploit. The very isolation that offers peace to so many can offer opportunity to the few who wish to do harm. The silence of the forest, which can feel so comforting, can also muffle a final, desperate cry for help, a sound lost to the wind, unheard by anyone but the towering, indifferent trees. It is a silence that would be echoed, years earlier and thousands of miles away, in the rolling hills of another national park, where two young women, full of life and love, walked down a trail and into a mystery that would haunt a generation. Case 2, the Shenandoah National Park Murders. The path leading us to our next story is paved with a similar tragic irony. We leave the granite peaks of California and travel east, across the continent, to the ancient rolling mountains of Virginia. Here lies Shenandoah National Park, a landscape of softer beauty, of misty hollows and gentle, forested slopes. It is a place defined by the iconic Skyline Drive, a 105-mile road that winds along the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains, offering breathtaking vistas at every turn. Unlike the rugged, imposing grandeur of Yosemite, Shenandoah feels more intimate, more accessible. It's a park of quiet trails, babbling streams, and dense canopies of oak and hickory that create a sense of deep, peaceful enclosure. In the spring of 1996, this tranquil wilderness was alive with the vibrant green of new life, a perfect picture of pastoral serenity. It was this very promise of peace that drew two young women, Laura Lawley Winans and Julie Williams, into its embrace. Lawley, 26, and Julie, 24, were a couple deeply in love not just with each other but with the natural world. They were experienced and respectful adventurers. Lawley was a skilled outdoors woman, having led wilderness trips for a Minnesota-based organization called With Women, which specialized in outdoor adventures for women. She was competent, confident, and felt more at home under a canopy of stars than under a roof. Julie was a geology student at Carleton College, a brilliant and passionate young woman with a keen eye for the stories told by rocks and landscapes. Together, they were a perfect match, their skills and passions complementing each other. They were preparing for a summer of field studies and had decided to spend a week decompressing in Shenandoah, a final, quiet retreat before their busy season began. They were accompanied by their beloved dog, a beautiful black and white husky retriever mix named Taj. They arrived in the park in mid-May, setting up their lives in a small tent, surrounded by the quiet hum of the forest. They planned to hike, to explore the famous White Oak Canyon Trail with its series of stunning waterfalls, and to simply exist in the rhythm of the wilderness. They were last seen on May 24, 1996, by other hikers. They were smiling, happy, two people in their element, accompanied by their loyal dog. They were on a trail, heading towards their campsite, and then they simply vanished from view, swallowed by the immense, quiet indifference of the woods. A week later, on May 31st, Lawley's father, who had been expecting a call, grew worried. It was unlike Lawley, a responsible and experienced leader, to be out of touch for so long without notice. He contacted the National Park Service to report them missing. A search was immediately organized. Park rangers, familiar with the terrain, began to scour the area near the Skyland Resort and the White Oak Canyon Trail system, places Lawley and Julie were known to frequent. On the morning of Saturday, June 1st, a park ranger searching off the beaten path along a little-used fire road known as the Bridle Path noticed something amiss. About a quarter-mile from Skyline Drive, tucked away in a dense thicket, he found their campsite. The scene was eerily quiet. The tent was still standing. Their gear seemed to be in order. But as he drew closer, a sense of profound wrongness settled over him. There was no sign of Lawley or Julie. But then he saw Taj. The dog was there, tied to a tree, alive and unharmed, but clearly distressed. The presence of the dog left behind was the first concrete sign that this was not a simple case of lost hikers. People like Lawley and Julie would never abandon their animal. The ranger called for backup. A more thorough search of the immediate vicinity began. The dread mounted with every passing moment. And then, about 100 yards from the tent, in a secluded spot with a steep drop-off, they found them. The discovery was a scene of such controlled, intimate brutality that it sent a shockwave through the seasoned law enforcement officers who responded. Lolly and Julie were inside their zipped-up sleeping bags. They had both been bound with duct tape. Their mouths had been gagged, and their throats had been slit. The nature of the killing was deeply personal and chillingly methodical. The killer had taken his time. He had rendered them helpless before ending their lives. The scene was not one of frenzied rage, but of cold, calculated execution. The fact that he had left their dog unharmed was a detail that was both puzzling and deeply disturbing, a strange act of mercy or perhaps indifference in the midst of unspeakable violence. Because the murders occurred on federal land, the FBI immediately took charge of the investigation. The case became a top priority, a high-profile whodunit that captured national attention. The park, a symbol of American natural heritage, had been desecrated. The investigation, codenamed Shenmue for Shenandoah Murders, was massive. Hundreds of agents and local law enforcement officers descended on the area. They conducted more than 1,500 interviews, chasing down every possible lead, no matter how small. The crime scene was meticulously processed, but the wilderness which had so effectively hidden the crime was now an obstacle to solving it. The killer had left behind precious little physical evidence. There was no murder weapon. The use of bindings and the nature of the wounds suggested a killer who was organized and forensically aware. He had moved with purpose and stealth. Almost immediately, a powerful and pervasive theory took hold. This was a hate crime. Lolly and Julie were an openly lesbian couple. In the mid-1990s, the idea that their sexuality had made them a target was not just plausible, it seemed probable to many. This narrative was amplified by the media and advocacy groups, who saw the murders as a brutal example of the violence faced by the LGBTQ+ community. Investigators had to consider this angle seriously. Was this a local bigot who had stumbled upon their camp and been sent into a rage? Or was it something else entirely? The FBI, while acknowledging the possibility of a hate crime, remained officially open to all theories. They profiled the killer as likely a white male, familiar with the park, who was comfortable in the outdoors and harbored a deep-seated rage against women. The investigation dragged on for months, then years, with no arrests. The leads grew cold. The case became a source of immense frustration for the FBI and a constant open wound for the Winans and Williams families. They were forced to grieve in the public eye, their personal tragedy becoming a symbol for a larger social issue, all while the man responsible remained a phantom. The lack of resolution was agonizing. The park, for its part, tried to move on, but a shadow now lingered over its misty trails. The story of Lolly and Julie became a cautionary tale whispered among hikers, a dark piece of folklore rooted in a horrifying truth. Then, in 1997, a year after the murders, a glimmer of hope. Investigators began to focus on a man named Darrell David Rice. Rice was a troubled individual with a history of harassing and assaulting women. Crucially, in 1997, he had attempted to abduct a female cyclist in the same area of the park, trying to pull her from her bike and into his truck. She fought him off and escaped, providing a detailed description that led to his arrest. When investigators looked into Rice's background, they found a man who seemed to fit their profile. He lived nearby, he drove a truck that had been seen in the area around the time of the murders, and he was known to make unsolicited, aggressive advances towards women. During questioning, Rice was evasive and his stories were inconsistent. He eventually admitted to being in the park often but denied any involvement in the murders. The case against him was circumstantial but compelling. Federal prosecutors felt they had their man. However, they lacked the direct evidence, the smoking gun, to charge him with the murders. The DNA and hair samples collected from the crime scene in 1996 were subjected to the forensic testing available at the time. The results were inconclusive. Some hairs found at the scene were said to be microscopically consistent with Rice's hair, a type of analysis that is now considered highly unreliable and subjective, far from the certainty of a DNA match. Frustrated by the lack of definitive evidence to charge him for the Shenandoah murders, the U.S. Attorney's Office took an aggressive and unusual legal approach. They prosecuted Darrell Rice in federal court for the 1997 attempted abduction of the cyclist. Their strategy, which they called Gateway to Murder, was to introduce evidence and testimony related to the Winans-Williams murders during the sentencing phase of the abduction trial. They hoped to convince the judge that Rice was, in fact, the killer and that he should receive a life sentence for the abduction as a result. It was a legally controversial move, an attempt to punish a man for a crime he hadn't been formally charged with. The judge allowed it. Rice was convicted of the attempted abduction and, based in part on the suggestion that he was a far greater danger, was sentenced to life in prison. For a time, it seemed like a form of backdoor justice had been served. The FBI and many in the public believed the Shenandoah killer was behind bars. The families, however, never felt a true sense of closure. The cloud of legal ambiguity remained. And then the case took a stunning turn. In the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. The evidence from the 1996 crime scene, which had been carefully preserved, was resubmitted for more sophisticated analysis. In 2001, the FBI laboratory conducted new tests on the hairs and any potential DNA found at the scene. The results were unequivocal and shocking. The DNA did not belong to Darrell David Rice. He was definitively, scientifically excluded as a contributor to the DNA found at the crime scene. The man who had been the sole focus of the investigation for years, who had been publicly branded as the killer, was innocent of this particular crime. The revelation was a bombshell. It meant the real killer had been free for all those years. The investigation was thrown back to square one, the case officially re-entering the cold case files. For Darrell Rice, it was a vindication that came too late. He remained in prison for the cyclist assault, his name forever linked to a crime he did not commit. For the families, it was a devastating setback, reopening old wounds and erasing the fragile sense of justice they may have felt. The mystery of the Shenandoah murders was once again as deep and impenetrable as the forest in which it had occurred. For nearly 2 more decades, the case lay dormant, a ghost in the FBI's archives. The names Lolly Winans and Julie Williams were synonymous with a tragic, unsolved mystery. The families continue to honor their memory through advocacy and the Lolly and Julie Memorial Award, which supported projects promoting outdoor safety and celebrating the spirit of adventure they embodied. But the question of who had committed such a monstrous act and why remained unanswered. The silence from the killer was absolute. The final chapter of this long, painful story would be written not by a confession or a new witness, but by a revolution in forensic science, genetic genealogy. This new technique allows investigators to take an unknown DNA profile from a crime scene and upload it to public genealogy databases to search for relatives of the potential suspect. By building family trees from these distant genetic connections, they can narrow down the pool of potential suspects from millions to a single individual. It is a powerful tool that has solved dozens of cold cases across the country. In 2021, the FBI quietly reopened the case, this time armed with this new weapon. They took the unknown male DNA profile from the 1996 crime scene and, working with a private lab, began the painstaking work of building a family tree. The process was slow and methodical. Finally, after years of dead ends, the genetic lines converged on one name, Walter Leo Jackson Sr. The name meant nothing at first, but as investigators dug into his history, a chilling portrait emerged. Jackson was a local man from the Cleveland, Ohio area. He was also a prolific and convicted serial rapist. He had a long and violent criminal record filled with attacks on women. He was known to be an avid hiker and a painter of landscapes, and investigators found evidence that he had frequented Shenandoah National Park. His known crimes often involved binding his victims. He was a predator who, like Stainer in Yosemite, used the veneer of normalcy to hide a monstrous core. He fit the original profile of the killer perfectly. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Investigators obtained a direct DNA comparison, and it was a conclusive match to the DNA found at the murder scene of Lolly Winans and Julie Williams. After 28 years, they had their man. The phantom finally had a face. But justice, in this case, would be a quiet, posthumous affair. Walter Leo Jackson Sr. would never stand trial. He would never face the families of his victims in a courtroom. He had died in March of 2018 in an Ohio prison where he was serving a sentence for his other violent crimes. In June 2024, the FBI officially announced that Jackson was the killer, formally closing one of the most infamous cold cases in the history of the National Park Service. The resolution brought answers, but not the closure that a trial might have provided. It confirmed that the murders were likely not a targeted hate crime, but rather the random, predatory act of a serial offender who saw two women in an isolated spot and seized the opportunity to enact his violent fantasies. Lolly and Julie were not killed for who they were, but simply because they were there, their peaceful retreat tragically intersecting with the path of a monster. The case of the Shenandoah murders is a testament to the quiet persistence of justice, but also a story of its profound delays and detours. It is a reminder of how easily the truth can be obscured, how an investigation can be led astray by plausible but incorrect theories, and how an innocent man can live for decades under the shadow of a crime he didn't commit. And it speaks to the chilling reality that the vastness of the wilderness does not just hide the bodies of victims, but can also hide the identity of their killers for generations. Sometimes, however, the wilderness does not hide the body. Sometimes it swallows the person whole, leaving behind nothing but a void, a mystery that begins the moment a man walks out of his door and vanishes into the thin, dry air of the desert. Case 3. The murder of Ranger Paul Fugate. The desert does not offer the same gentle embrace as the forested hills of Shenandoah. It is a landscape of stark truths and harsh realities. It does not hide its dangers behind a veil of lush green, but displays them openly under a vast, unforgiving sky. And sometimes its greatest truth is the finality of silence. It is a place where a person can be erased, absorbed into the heat and the dust, leaving behind not a body but a question mark branded onto the land itself. This is a story about that kind of silence, a mystery that begins the moment a man, a guardian of the wilderness, walks out of his truck and vanishes into the thin, dry air of southeastern Arizona. Our story takes us to the Chiricahua National Monument, a place so strange and beautiful it's often called a wonderland of rocks. It is a sky island, a steep mountain range rising dramatically from the surrounding desert grasslands. Over millions of years, volcanic eruptions and relentless erosion have sculpted the rock into a breathtaking and bizarre forest of stone spires, balanced rocks, and towering pinnacles known as hoodoos. It's a vertical world of narrow canyons and winding trails that feel both ancient and alien. It was here, amidst this geological spectacle, that 41-year-old National Park Service Ranger Paul Fugate worked. Paul was not a rookie. He was a seasoned, dedicated professional, a man who had found his life's calling in the Park Service. He was quiet, observant, and deeply respected by his colleagues. He understood the rhythms of the desert, its subtle dangers, and its profound beauty. He was married to Dodie Fugate, and their life together was rooted in the simple, profound peace of this remote corner of the world. Paul was not the kind of man to take foolish risks. He was methodical, experienced, and intimately familiar with every trail and canyon within the monument's 12,000 acres. He was, in short, the last person anyone would expect to get into trouble here. January 13, 1980 dawned as a typical winter day in the high desert, cool, crisp, and clear. For Paul Fugate, it was a routine Sunday on the job. His task for the afternoon was simple, a short hike to check on the condition of the Bonita Canyon Trail, a relatively easy loop at the eastern edge of the monument. Before heading out, he stopped at the visitor center, chatting briefly with a colleague, another ranger named Kim Uppinkamp. He was in good spirits, his usual calm and steady self. He told Kim where he was going and that he would be back in a couple of hours. At approximately 2 p.m. he made his final radio transmission, a standard check-in to let dispatch know he was leaving his vehicle and beginning his hike. The transmission was clear and routine. It was the last time anyone ever heard from Paul Fugate. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, sharp shadows across the rock formations, Dodie Fugate began to feel the first stirrings of unease. Paul was punctual. It wasn't like him to be late without calling. When he still hadn't returned by nightfall, her unease turned to genuine worry. She contacted the park's chief ranger, who immediately initiated a search. The first clue was his locked patrol truck, parked exactly where it should be, at the mouth of Bonita Canyon. Inside, on the front seat, were his keys. His clipboard lay there as well. Everything looked perfectly normal, as if he had just stepped out for a moment and was about to return. But as rangers scanned the area with their flashlights, they noticed something odd. On the ground near the passenger side door lay a single, unsmoked cigarette. Paul Fugate did not smoke. It was a small detail, a piece of information that didn't fit, but in the absence of any other clues, it felt significant, a tiny crack in the veneer of normalcy. By the next morning, what began as a search for a missing colleague had escalated into a massive operation, one of the largest and most intensive in Arizona's history. The Chiricahua Monument became the epicenter of a frantic, desperate effort. The Cochise County Sheriff's Department, U.S. Border Patrol, the Forest Service, and even military personnel from nearby Fort Huachuca converged on the scene. Helicopters with infrared sensors buzzed overhead, their rotors echoing off the canyon walls, while hundreds of searchers on foot and horseback fanned out across the rugged terrain. They were joined by expert trackers, men who could read the desert floor like a book, capable of spotting a broken twig or a disturbed pebble. Days turned into a week, and the week turned into two. The search was methodical, painstaking. Teams formed human chains, moving slowly and deliberately through every canyon, over every ridge, and into every crevice. They searched with a grim determination fueled by a mixture of hope and professional pride. They were looking for one of their own, but the desert yielded nothing. The trackers found Paul's faint footprints leading away from his truck and onto the trail, but then, inexplicably, they just stopped. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No discarded equipment. No evidence that he had slipped and fallen into a ravine. There was just nothing. It was as if Paul Fugate had been neatly and cleanly plucked from the face of the earth. As the official search wound down, the mystery only deepened. Investigators were forced to confront a series of unsettling possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. An accident seemed almost impossible. Fugate was too experienced, and the trail too familiar. Even if he had suffered a sudden medical emergency or a fall, the sheer scale of the search made it highly improbable that his body would not be found. Suicide or a voluntary disappearance were also considered and quickly dismissed. He was by all accounts a happy man, dedicated to his wife and his career. He left behind his wallet, his keys, his life. People who choose to disappear don't typically do it on foot, in their work uniform, in the middle of a shift. That left only one plausible, terrifying explanation: foul play. Paul Fugate had been abducted and murdered. This theory shifted the focus of the investigation from the ground to the human element. Who would want to harm a park ranger? The answer, many believed, lay in the park's geography. The Chiricahua Mountains sit uncomfortably close to the U.S.-Mexico border, making them a natural and well-established corridor for drug trafficking. In 1980, this remote and rugged terrain was an ideal route for smugglers moving marijuana and other narcotics north. The most likely scenario, and the one the FBI came to favor, was that Ranger Fugate, on his routine trail check, had inadvertently stumbled upon something he was not meant to see. A drug deal in progress. A cache of narcotics. A group of armed men. In that world, a witness, especially a uniformed law enforcement officer, is not a problem to be avoided. A witness is a liability to be eliminated. This theory explained the chilling efficiency of his disappearance. There was no struggle because he would have been surprised and vastly outnumbered and outgunned. His body was never found because his killers would have had the motive and the means to transport it far away, burying it in the vast, empty expanse of the desert where it would likely never be discovered. The single cigarette found near his truck could have been dropped by one of the perpetrators, a fleeting, careless gesture in a moment of high tension. For Dodie Fugate, the lack of answers was a unique and cruel form of torture. Her husband was gone, but without a body, without a crime scene, without any official confirmation of his death, she was left in a state of suspended grief. For years, she refused to have him declared legally dead, clinging to the slimmest sliver of hope that he might one day walk out of the desert as mysteriously as he had vanished into it. She became the keeper of his memory, a quiet but persistent voice ensuring that the case file for Paul Fugate remained open, that his name was not forgotten. The National Park Service, shaken by the loss of one of its own, implemented new safety protocols, the Fugate procedure requiring rangers in remote areas to work in pairs and maintain stricter radio check-in schedules. His disappearance left an institutional scar. Years passed. The case grew cold, relegated to a dusty file cabinet, a permanent monument to an unsolved mystery. But the story was not quite over. It had one more strange, ghostly chapter left to unfold. In the late 1980s, two hikers were exploring a remote canyon about 10 miles from where Fugate had disappeared. There, partially buried in the sandy wash of a dry creek bed, they made a shocking discovery: human skeletal remains. As they stood there, processing the grim find, a man appeared. He was described as being rough-looking, in his late 30s, and carrying a backpack. He approached them and seeing what they had found, he spoke to them in a low, menacing voice. He told them his name was Randy. He then proceeded to tell them a chilling story. He said that he and his partner had been smuggling drugs through the area years ago when they were stopped by a ranger. He claimed they had killed the ranger, dismembered his body, and scattered the parts throughout the canyon. He ended his terrifying confession with a threat: the less you know about this, the better off you'll be. The hikers, terrified, left the area and immediately reported the encounter to the authorities. The Cochise County Sheriff's Office launched a new, intensive search of the canyon described by the hikers. They searched for weeks, but they found nothing. A flash flood had swept through the canyon shortly after the hikers' report, and it was possible that the floodwaters had washed away the remains, burying them under tons of sand and debris forever. Or perhaps the mysterious Randy had returned and removed them himself. Or, in the most frustrating possibility of all, perhaps the entire story was a fabrication, a cruel hoax. There was no way to know for sure. The tantalizing clue, the potential confession that could have finally solved the mystery, dissolved back into the silence of the desert, leaving behind only more questions. To this day, the disappearance of Paul Fugate remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the National Park Service. No one has ever been charged. No body has ever been recovered. He is a ghost who haunts the wonderland of rocks, a symbol of the profound and terrifying vulnerability that exists even for those we believe are the most capable and prepared. His case demonstrates that the predator in the wilderness is not always a creature of instinct, like a mountain lion or a bear. Sometimes it is a creature of calculated criminal enterprise, ruthlessly protecting its interests. But there is another kind of predator who stalks these beautiful landscapes. Not one motivated by money or organized crime, but by a deeper, more personal, and far more terrifying compulsion. This is a predator who hunts not for profit, but for the sheer, dark pleasure of the act itself. A predator who can blend in with the innocent, walking the same sun-dappled trails, a monster hiding in plain sight. Case 4, the trailside killer of Mount Tamalpais. The predator who stalks the wilderness is not always a creature of organized crime, nor a specter vanishing into the vast emptiness of the desert. Sometimes, the predator is a man driven by a compulsion so dark and personal that it defies rational explanation. He does not kill for profit or to silence a witness. He hunts for the sheer, terrifying pleasure of the act itself, a wolf cloaked in the skin of a sheep, walking the same sun-dappled trails as his unsuspecting prey. For our final case, we travel back to the Golden Hills of Northern California, to a mountain that serves as the beloved backyard for one of America's most vibrant urban centers. A place where the illusion of safety was about to be systematically and brutally dismantled. Mount Tamalpais, or Mount Tam as it is affectionately known, is more than just a mountain. For the people of Marin County and the San Francisco Bay Area, it is a sanctuary, a landmark, and a playground. Its golden, grass-covered slopes rise majestically above the Pacific Ocean and the bay, its redwood groves offering cool respite from the California sun. Its extensive network of trails is a haven for hikers, joggers, and nature lovers seeking a quick escape from the urban sprawl below. Unlike the remote, imposing national parks of our previous stories, Mount Tam is intimately woven into the fabric of the community. It is a place of weekend picnics, of first dates, of solitary jogs to clear the mind. It felt safe. It felt familiar. In the autumn of 1979, this profound sense of security was about to become a deadly illusion. The first hint of the darkness to come was the death of 43-year-old Etta Kane. On August 19, 1979, her body was discovered near a hiking trail on the eastern slope of the mountain. She had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Etta was a mother of 4, a recent Danish immigrant who had fallen in love with the mountain's beauty and often hiked its trails alone. Her death was shocking, a violent intrusion into a peaceful landscape. But at the time, it was viewed by authorities as a tragic but isolated incident, perhaps a robbery gone wrong or a personal dispute that had spilled over into the park. There was no way to know that it was the opening act of a reign of terror. The silence lasted for over a year. The memory of Etta Kane's murder faded and the public's fear subsided. The trails of Mount Tam were once again filled with the sounds of happy hikers and the rustle of wind through the madrona trees. Then on the afternoon of October 13, 1980, the killer returned. 2 women, 27-year-old Barbara Schwartz and her friend, another young woman, were hiking on a trail near the same area where Etta Kane had been found. Barbara was a vibrant, passionate woman who worked as a computer programmer and had a deep love for the outdoors. As they walked, a man emerged from the trees. He was described as unassuming, almost nerdy, a middle-aged man who didn't look particularly threatening. He brandished a handgun. He led them off the trail to a more secluded spot where he bound them. His motive was clearly sexual assault. In the midst of the horrific attack, Barbara Schwartz courageously fought back. In the struggle, the assailant shot her. She died there on the forest floor. Her friend, though also assaulted, managed to survive. She played dead until the attacker fled, then managed to free herself and stumble back to the trail to flag down help. The attack sent a shockwave of fear through Marin County. This was no longer an isolated incident. This was a pattern. The survivor's description of the attacker, however, was clouded by trauma. She described a man of average height and build but could offer few other distinguishing features. The fear was real, but the predator remained a phantom. The Marin County Sheriff's Office stepped up patrols and warnings were issued to the public, especially to women, advising them not to hike alone. But the killer was just getting started. Less than 6 weeks later, on November 28, 1980, the day after Thanksgiving, the killer claimed 2 more lives. And Alderson, a 26-year-old music student from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, had gone for a hike on Mount Tam. She was a gifted cellist, a gentle soul seeking a moment of peace in nature. She never returned. Her body was found days later, not far from where the previous attacks had occurred. She had been shot and killed. The investigation into her murder was still in its early stages when, just 2 weeks later, the phantom struck again, this time with even greater audacity. On December 13th, 22-year-old Shauna May and her 25-year-old boyfriend, Richard Stowers, were hiking in the Point Reyes National Seashore, just a short drive north of Mount Tam. Shauna was a student at Dominican College, bright and full of promise. While not on Mount Tam itself, the proximity and nature of the crime immediately linked it in the minds of investigators and the terrified public. The couple was ambushed on a trail. Shauna was sexually assaulted and then shot to death. Richard was also shot and killed, presumably because he was a witness. A double homicide in broad daylight. The killer was becoming bolder, more brazen. The Bay Area was now in the grip of a full-blown panic. The media dubbed the unknown assailant the Trailside Killer. The beautiful, rolling hills of Marin County, once a symbol of idyllic, counterculture living, were now a landscape of fear. Hiking, a beloved local pastime, became an act of defiance. The trails grew quiet, abandoned by all but the most determined or foolhardy. Law enforcement was facing immense pressure. The murders were happening across different jurisdictions: Mount Tamalpais State Park, Point Reyes National Seashore, and involved multiple agencies. To coordinate the sprawling investigation, a multi-agency task force was formed, bringing together the Marin County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and other local police departments. They were hunting for a ghost who left few clues. The weapon was believed to be a .38 caliber handgun, but the shell casings recovered were from common ammunition, difficult to trace. The killer moved like a wraith, appearing and disappearing, leaving a trail of death but little else. The profile of the killer was that of an organized, confident sexual sadist who was comfortable in the outdoors and likely lived or worked in the area, giving him an intimate knowledge of the trail systems. He was a hunter in the truest, most terrifying sense of the word. The new year, 1981, brought no respite. On March 29th, the killer returned to Mount Tamalpais. This time, the victims were 20-year-old Cynthia Moreland and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Dean Furlong. They were students at the College of Marin, a young couple in love, spending a sunny afternoon hiking. Like the others, they were ambushed. Cynthia was shot and killed. Dean miraculously survived a gunshot wound to the head. He was found wandering in a daze, his memory of the attack shattered by the trauma and his injury. He could provide little help to the investigators. The Trailside Killer had struck again, and once more, he had seemingly gotten away with it. By now, he was credited with at least 5 murders. The public was terrified, and the task force was desperate for a break. That break would come on a sunny spring day, May 2, 1981. It would come in the form of unimaginable terror, but also of incredible courage. Ellen Hansen, a 26-year-old veterinary student at UC Davis, and her boyfriend, Stephen Hartle, were hiking on a trail near the east peak of Mount Tam. Ellen was a dedicated student and animal lover who was described by her friends as smart, tough, and resourceful. Stephen was also a student, strong and athletic. As they hiked, they were confronted by a man who fit the now infamous description, middle-aged, nondescript, but carrying a gun. The man was David Carpenter. At 50 years old, he was an employee at a printing company in San Francisco. He was a man with a severe stutter and a hidden, monstrous past. He had spent years in prison for a prior violent assault and kidnapping, but had been paroled and was living a seemingly quiet life. To his coworkers, he was just Dave, a quiet guy who kept to himself. But on the trails of Mount Tam, he was a predator. Carpenter forced Ellen and Stephen off the trail at gunpoint. He tied them up. His intentions were clear. But Ellen Hansen was not a passive victim. She fought back fiercely, screaming, kicking, and resisting her attacker with every ounce of her strength. Enraged by her defiance, Carpenter shot her in the head, killing her instantly. He then turned the gun on Stephen Hartle and shot him twice at close range. Believing both were dead, Carpenter fled the scene. But Stephen Hartle was not dead. Despite his grievous wounds, a bullet lodged in his neck. He was conscious. Fueled by adrenaline and a primal will to survive, he managed to untie himself. He knew he was the only person who had seen the killer's face and lived to tell about it. He staggered and crawled for nearly a mile back to the trail, where he flagged down other hikers. He was bleeding profusely, on the verge of collapse, but his mind was sharp. He gave a detailed description of his attacker. A white male about 50 years old with a noticeable stutter. He described his clothes, and most critically, he described his car, which he had glimpsed as Carpenter led them away. A small, beat-up, orange or red Datsun or Fiat. This was the breakthrough the task force had been praying for. For the first time, they had a detailed, reliable description of the killer and his vehicle. The information was immediately broadcast to the public. A composite sketch of the suspect was created and plastered across newspapers and television screens. The tip that broke the case came not from a random citizen, but from someone who knew the killer well. A coworker of David Carpenter's at the printing press saw the sketch and heard the description. He knew Dave had a severe stutter. He knew Dave drove a beat-up red Fiat. And he knew Dave's dark criminal history. He made the call. Suddenly, all the pieces fell into place. Investigators descended on Carpenter's history. They discovered his prior convictions for violent crimes, his parole status, his quiet life that provided the perfect cover. Surveillance was immediately set up. They watched him, tracked his movements. They located his red Fiat. The gun they believed he used, a .38 caliber revolver, had been purchased by a friend of his, a man who had worked with him at a different company. This friend, when questioned, admitted to buying the gun for Carpenter, who, as a convicted felon, could not legally purchase one himself. On May 14, 1981, just 12 days after the attack on Hansen and Hartle, the trap was sprung. Police arrested David Carpenter as he arrived for his shift at the printing company. The arrest was quiet, undramatic. The monster who had terrorized the Bay Area for nearly 2 years was just a stooped, middle-aged man with a stutter. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Stephen Hartle positively identified him in a lineup. The gun was recovered. Ballistics tests conclusively matched it to the bullets and casings found at multiple crime scenes. A search of his home uncovered further incriminating evidence. David Carpenter, the trailside killer, had been caught. His trial was a media sensation. The prosecution laid out the horrifying timeline of his crimes, linking him definitively to the murders of Ann Alderson, Richard Stowers, Shauna May, Cynthia Moreland, and Ellen Hansen, as well as the attempted murder of Stephen Hartle and others. Though suspected in several other slayings, including Etta Keynes, he was tried and convicted for these cases. The jury found him guilty, and in 1984 he was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. He was later convicted and sentenced to death again for the murders of Barbara Schwartz and another woman. David Carpenter was sent to San Quentin's death row, ironically located at the foot of the very mountain he had turned into his personal hunting ground. He remained there for decades, a living embodiment of the banal face of evil, until he died of natural causes in prison in March of 2022, at the age of 91, having cheated the executioner but not his own mortality. The case of the trailside killer is a chilling exploration of how evil can flourish in the most idyllic of settings. It demonstrates that the wilderness does not need to be remote or desolate to be dangerous. The terror was not in the isolation but in the terrifying proximity. The monster was not a stranger from a distant land. He was a neighbor, a co-worker, a man who walked among his victims, his dark compulsions hidden behind a quiet demeanor and a speech impediment. He turned a place of peace and recreation into a landscape of fear, forever staining the golden hills of Mount Tamalpais with the memory of the lives he so brutally stole. The stories we've shared tonight, from the granite peaks of Yosemite to the rolling hills of Virginia, from the arid desert of Arizona to the sun-kissed slopes of Mount Tamalpais, are etched into the very landscapes where they occurred. These national parks and wild spaces remain places of breathtaking beauty, cathedrals of nature that call to the human spirit. But they are also silent witnesses to the darkest of human acts. They remind us that the sanctuary we seek in the wilderness is fragile and that the greatest danger we may ever face there is not from the wild itself, but from the predator who walks on two legs. The silence that now blankets these trails is for the victims Carol, Julie, Sylvina, Joie, Lolly, Julie, Paul, Etta, Barbara, Anne, Richard, Shauna, Cynthia, and Ellen, and for the profound and enduring questions their stories leave behind in the quiet of the night. We hope you found this exploration of these somber cases both informative and respectful to the memory of those lost. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well and try not to dream of the shadows that linger just beyond the campfire's light. Good night. Welcome back to the Crime Folio. In the quiet corridors of healing, where life is preserved and pain is eased, a darker narrative sometimes unfolds. It is a story that subverts our most fundamental expectations of safety and sanctuary. We place an almost sacred trust in the hands of our doctors. They are the custodians of our vulnerabilities, the architects of our recovery. But what happens when the very individuals dedicated to saving lives become the targets of those they have sworn to help, or those who see their work not as a service, but as a sin? This is the deadly diagnosis when the healer becomes the hunted, and the clinic becomes a crime scene. Case 1. The murder of Dr. George Tiller. The city of Wichita, Kansas, rests in the heartland of America, a place often defined by its sprawling plains and a quiet, steadfast conservatism. It is a city of industry and faith, where community values are held in high regard. But for decades, Wichita was also a battleground, the epicenter of one of the most volatile and deeply entrenched conflicts in modern American history. The conflict was not fought over land or resources, but over ideology, and its front line was a modest-looking brick building at 5107 East Kellogg Drive. This was the location of women's healthcare services, and the man at its center was Dr. George Richard Tiller. To understand the events of May 31, 2009, one must first understand the man and the storm that had surrounded him for most of his professional life. George Tiller was not born into this conflict. He began his career in the United States Navy, serving as a flight surgeon. He and his family had planned a life far from controversy. But in 1970, a plane crash claimed the lives of his parents, his sister, and his brother-in-law. Tiller, then a young doctor, returned to Wichita to take over his father's family practice. It was a practice that, among other services, discreetly performed abortions which had only recently become legal in the state. Initially, Tiller was hesitant. He was a devoutly religious man, a Lutheran who wrestled with the moral complexities of the procedure. But he also saw women arriving at his clinic in desperate, often tragic circumstances. He saw the consequences of illegal, unsafe abortions. Over time, his perspective solidified into a clear philosophy, one he would carry for the rest of his life: trust women. He believed that women, faced with profound and often heartbreaking decisions about their health and their futures, had the capacity and the right to make their own choices. This conviction led him to become one of the very few doctors in the entire United States willing to perform late-term abortions. This was not a service for those who were merely indecisive. Tiller's patients were often facing catastrophic medical diagnoses. They were women whose wanted pregnancies had gone terribly wrong, fetuses with fatal abnormalities, conditions incompatible with life outside the womb, or pregnancies that posed a mortal threat to the mother herself. He saw his work not as ending a life, but as an act of compassion in the face of unavoidable tragedy. He was providing a medical service that, while legally protected, was so stigmatized that almost no one else would. But in the court of public opinion, particularly among the burgeoning anti-abortion movement, Tiller's work was seen in a starkly different light. To them, he was not a compassionate physician. He was a murderer, and his clinic in Wichita became a symbol, a focal point for their outrage. The first major assault came in 1986. On a summer night, a pipe bomb was planted at the clinic. The explosion tore a hole in the building, a violent declaration of intent. No one was harmed, but the message was clear. Tiller was not deterred. He rebuilt the clinic, reinforcing it, making it more secure. It began to take on the appearance of a fortress, a necessary defense against a siege that was only just beginning. The summer of 1991 marked a significant escalation. A national anti-abortion group, Operation Rescue, descended upon Wichita for what they called the Summer of Mercy. For 46 days, the city was in turmoil. Thousands of protesters blockaded the entrances to Tiller's clinic and others in the city. They laid on the pavement, chained themselves together, and screamed at patients and staff. The scale was immense. Over 2,600 arrests were made as police in riot gear clashed with demonstrators day after day. The national media watched as Wichita became a symbol of the nation's deep-seated division. Through it all, Dr. Tiller continued to go to work. He obtained a federal injunction to keep the protesters at bay, and every day, he walked past the picket lines, past the signs that bore his face next to monstrous caricatures, past the voices that condemned him to hell. The threats were no longer abstract. They were personal, constant, and increasingly menacing. His name and address were circulated on pamphlets. He was a marked man. On the morning of August 19, 1993, the threat became brutally physical. As Dr. Tiller drove away from his clinic, a woman named Rochelle Shelley Shannon stepped out and fired 5 rounds from a handgun into his car. Both of his arms were struck. Bleeding, Tiller managed to drive to safety. Shelley Shannon was a radical activist who, it would later be discovered, was also involved in a series of arsons and acid attacks on abortion clinics across the western United States. She saw her actions not as attempted murder, but as a righteous act to stop what she considered to be a greater evil. Most people, after being shot for their work, would have stopped. They would have closed the clinic, moved away, and chosen a life of peace and anonymity. Dr. George Tiller went back to work the very next day. His resolve, it seemed, was as fortified as the walls of his clinic. When asked why, his answer was simple. He knew that if he stopped, there would be no one to help the women who came to him from all over the country, women in the most desperate moments of their lives. For him, capitulating to violence meant abandoning them. And so he endured. He wore a bulletproof vest. He drove an armored car. His clinic installed bulletproof glass and heightened security measures. His life became a paradox, a healer living under the constant threat of death. As the years went on, the nature of the campaign against him evolved. The street-level protests continued, but a new front opened in the media and in politics. Conservative commentators, most notably Bill O'Reilly on his Fox News program, The O'Reilly Factor, began to focus intensely on Tiller. Over several years, O'Reilly mentioned Tiller by name dozens of times on his show, repeatedly referring to him as Tiller the Baby Killer, and accusing him of operating a death mill with little oversight. He presented Tiller's work not as a complex medical procedure for tragic cases, but as an on-demand service for callous women, executed for financial gain. This rhetoric, broadcast to millions nightly, painted Tiller not just as a doctor with a controversial practice, but as a monster. It stripped him of his humanity and recast him as a legitimate target for righteous fury. While these broadcasts never explicitly called for violence, they created an environment where such an act could be seen by some as not only justified but necessary. The constant, high-profile demonization served to sharpen the focus of those on the extremist fringes of the anti-abortion movement. One of those people was a man named Scott Philip Roeder. Roeder, born in 1958, was a man whose life had been a slow spiral into extremism. He had a history of mental health issues and financial troubles, including a bankruptcy. In the 1990s, he became deeply involved with the Freeman and sovereign citizen movements, fringe anti-government groups that believed the U.S. federal government was illegitimate. They often engaged in paper terrorism, filing bogus liens against public officials, and refusing to recognize the authority of the courts or law enforcement. Roeder had been convicted in 1996 for having explosives components in the trunk of his car after he was pulled over for not having a proper license plate, a common practice for sovereign citizens who reject state authority. His anti-government beliefs began to merge with a fervent, radical anti-abortion ideology. To Roeder, the government was not only illegitimate, it was complicit in what he viewed as a mass slaughter. And the ultimate symbol of this slaughter, the figurehead of this evil, was Dr. George Tiller. He had Tiller's clinic in his sights for years. The manager of a local car dealership would later recall Roeder coming in and talking obsessively about the clinic, stating that it needed to be taken care of. On extremist online forums, he posted in support of those who had used violence against abortion providers. He had come to believe in the doctrine of justifiable homicide, the idea that killing a doctor who performs abortions is not a crime, but a moral imperative to save the lives of the unborn. In the spring of 2009, Roeder's obsession crystallized into a plan. He began to stalk Dr. Tiller. This was not a crime of passion. It was a methodical, cold-blooded hunt. He learned Tiller's routines, his habits. He knew where he lived, where he worked, and where he worshipped. Tiller was a dedicated member of the Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita. He attended service every Sunday. He often served as an usher, greeting his fellow congregants in the church lobby, known as the narthex. For Roeder, the church was not a sanctuary that should be respected. It was the perfect, predictable location for an ambush. He purchased a .22 caliber handgun. On Friday, May 29th, 2 days before the murder, Roeder's red Ford Taurus was seen parked near the clinic. He was watching. On Saturday, May 30th, he drove to Kansas City, a few hours away, to meet with other anti-abortion activists. While there is no evidence they conspired with him, he was moving within the circles that nourished his extremism. He returned to Wichita that evening. He was ready. Sunday, May 31st, 2009, was a bright, clear morning. Inside the Reformation Lutheran Church, the atmosphere was one of quiet fellowship. The pews were filling up for the 10 a.m. service. Dr. Tiller, 67 years old, was standing in the foyer, fulfilling his duties as an usher. He was wearing a suit and tie, handing out church bulletins, and exchanging pleasantries with friends and fellow members of the congregation. He was a familiar, comforting presence. There was a children's choir performing that morning. The sound of their singing drifted from the sanctuary. At approximately 10:03 a.m., Scott Roeder walked into the church. He was not there to pray. He walked directly up to Dr. Tiller. He did not say a word. He simply raised the handgun, pressed the muzzle to the side of Tiller's head, just below his hairline and above his left eye, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the single gunshot was sharp, alien in the sacred space. It was followed by a moment of stunned silence, then chaos. Dr. Tiller collapsed to the floor. Roeder, his mission accomplished, turned and calmly walked out of the church. He did not run. 2 men from the congregation, alerted by the sound, saw Roeder leaving and gave chase. They got a clear look at him and his car. One of them, a former Marine, jotted down the license plate number on the palm of his hand, 225 DAA. Inside the church, parishioners, including a doctor and a nurse, rushed to Tiller's side. But the wound was catastrophic. The single bullet had caused immense, irreparable damage to his brain. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The man who had survived a bombing, a siege, and a previous shooting had been murdered, not in a dark alley or a fortified clinic, but in the peaceful foyer of his own church, surrounded by his community. The hunt for Scott Roeder was swift. The description of his car and the license plate number were broadcast to law enforcement across the state. An all-points bulletin was issued. For 3 hours, Roeder drove. He headed north on Interstate 35, away from Wichita. Perhaps he believed he would escape, or perhaps he didn't care. At around 1 p.m., about 170 miles away in a rural county, A sheriff's deputy spotted the red Ford Taurus. He pulled the car over. As officers approached with their weapons drawn, Scott Roeder showed no resistance. He put his hands up and got out of the car. He was calm, almost serene. When asked for his name, he reportedly said, "My name is Scott, the one you're looking for." Inside the car, they found the .22 caliber handgun used in the murder. The arrest was straightforward, but the legal battle to come would once again put the nation's deepest divisions on trial. Roeder never denied killing Dr. Tiller. In fact, he was proud of it. From jail, he gave interviews in which he confessed to the murder, explaining his rationale. "I shot him," he said, leaving no room for doubt. His entire legal strategy was to be built not on innocence, but on justification. His lawyers, appointed by the court, intended to argue that he was acting to prevent a greater harm. They planned to mount a necessity or justifiable homicide defense, arguing that Roeder's actions were necessary to save the lives of fetuses that Dr. Tiller would have aborted. This put the court in a precarious position. Allowing such a defense would have effectively put abortion itself on trial. It would have legitimized the idea that an individual can appoint themselves judge, jury, and executioner based on their personal moral or religious beliefs. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Nola Folstant, the same DA who had prosecuted the Summer of Mercy protesters nearly 2 decades earlier, argued vehemently against it. They contended that the case was simple. It was a case of first-degree premeditated murder. Roeder's motives, they argued, were irrelevant to the facts of the crime. The judge, Warren Wilbert, agreed with the prosecution. He ruled that the justifiable homicide defense was not permissible under Kansas law. Roeder would not be allowed to present his ideological crusade to the jury as a legal defense. His motive could be discussed, but it could not be used as an excuse for murder. Stripped of his primary defense, Roeder's trial became a matter of procedure. The evidence was overwhelming. There were eyewitnesses. There was the license plate number. There was his confession. The gun was his. His premeditation was clear from his stalking activities and his own statements. During the trial, the prosecution laid out the cold, hard facts of the case. They detailed the stalking, the purchase of the weapon, and the calm, deliberate way Roeder carried out the execution. Roeder himself took the stand, against his lawyer's advice. On the stand, he was unwavering. He admitted everything. "I stopped him," he said, showing no remorse. "That's what I did." He seemed to believe that even if the court of man convicted him, the court of God would vindicate him. On January 29, 2010, after just 37 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Scott Roeder guilty of first-degree murder. The speed of the verdict reflected the undeniable evidence. On April 1, 2010, he was sentenced to the hard 50, a mandatory minimum of 50 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was later modified to allow for parole eligibility after 25 years due to a Supreme Court ruling on sentencing guidelines, but for all intents and purposes, the 51-year-old man would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The murder of Dr. George Tiller sent shockwaves across the country. It was the culmination of decades of rhetoric that had dehumanized him. For his family and supporters, it was the tragic and infuriating loss of a brave, compassionate man who stood firm in his convictions despite unimaginable pressure. For his detractors, even those who publicly condemned the violence, his death marked the end of an era. Shortly after the murder, his family announced that his clinic, women's health care services, would be permanently closed. They could not bear the risk of another family member meeting the same fate. With Tiller's death, one of the last bastions for a specific, vital, and controversial medical procedure was gone. The case left a chilling legacy. It was a stark reminder that in battles of ideology, words have consequences. The constant labeling of a man as a killer in the public square had, for at least one person, served as a permission slip for murder. It demonstrated a terrifying new reality for medical professionals involved in politically charged fields. The threat was no longer just picket signs and angry words. It could be a single, determined individual who believed that violence was a sacred duty. The murder in the church foyer was not an isolated act of a lone madman. It was the logical, violent conclusion of a long and bitter war. And Dr. Tiller was not its only casualty. A similar war had been raging in other parts of the country, and another doctor had already paid the ultimate price, targeted not in a church, but in the sanctuary of his own home. Case 2. The assassination of Dr. Barnett Slepian. The war of ideology that claimed Dr. Tiller in 2009 was the evolution of a conflict that had been simmering with lethal intent for years. Long before Scott Roeder walked into a Wichita church, another man, driven by the same radical convictions, had already perfected the art of the faceless assassination. He operated not with a handgun at close range, but with a high-powered rifle from the shadows. His campaign of terror spanned 2 countries, and his final target was a beloved doctor in a place that seemed the very definition of suburban peace. Amherst, New York. Amherst, a leafy, affluent suburb of Buffalo, was a world away from the prairie battleground of Wichita. It was a town of quiet cul-de-sacs, good schools, and a strong sense of community. It was here that Dr. Barnett Bart Slepian had built his life and his practice. Born in 1946, Slepian was an obstetrician and gynecologist, a man who, like his father before him, had dedicated his life to women's health. He was known for his gentle demeanor, his deep empathy, and a wry sense of humor that could put even the most anxious patient at ease. He delivered thousands of babies in the Buffalo area, sharing in the most joyous moments of his patients' lives. But his practice, Buffalo GYN Women's Services, also provided abortions. And in the climate of the 1990s, this made him a target. For years, Slepian and his colleagues in upstate New York and across the border in Canada had been subjected to a relentless campaign of harassment. The protests were a constant feature outside his office. Activists would follow him, shout at him, and distribute menacing literature. One of the most common tactics was a wanted-style poster, featuring the doctor's name, photo, and home address, under headlines that called him a murderer. These were not just protests. They were personal, intimate threats designed to terrorize not only the doctors, but their families as well. Dr. Slepian, a man of profound conviction, refused to be intimidated. He believed fervently in a woman's right to choose and saw his work as an essential medical service. He wore a bulletproof vest to work. He had security cameras installed at his home. He taught his 4 young sons what to do if they saw a strange car or person near their house. This was the grim reality of being an abortion provider in America. A life lived in a state of high alert, where the threat of violence was a constant, humming background noise. The threat was not hypothetical. It was terrifyingly real. Beginning in the mid-1990s, a sniper had been targeting doctors in their homes. In November 1994, Dr. Garson Romelis was shot and nearly killed in his Vancouver home. In November 1995, Dr. Hugh Short was shot in his home in Ancaster, Ontario. In November 1997, Dr. Jack Feynman was wounded by a sniper in Winnipeg, Manitoba. A pattern had emerged. The attacks occurred in late autumn, often around the time of Remembrance Day, a solemn holiday in Canada. The sniper would wait in the wooded areas behind the doctors' homes, using the cover of darkness, and fire a single, powerful round through a window. The attacks were designed to wound, not kill, a tactic proponents called decommissioning the doctor. The message was clear: we know where you live. We can reach you anywhere. We can stop you. Law enforcement in both the US and Canada formed a joint task force, convinced they were hunting a single individual. They had a profile: a meticulous, patient, and highly mobile extremist. But they had no name. They called him the Phantom Sniper. In Amherst, Dr. Slepian was acutely aware that he was on the sniper's list. His name had appeared on extremist websites that celebrated the previous attacks. The protests outside his home had grown more intense. He and his wife, Lynn, had done everything they could to secure their home on a quiet, tree-lined street. But a determined hunter will always find a vulnerability. The hunter was a man named James Charles Kopp. Born in California in 1954, Kopp was a man who had renounced a conventional life for a single-minded, ascetic existence dedicated to his cause. He held a degree in biology but lived a transient life, moving between the homes of fellow anti-abortion activists. He owned few possessions and had no permanent address. Friends and family described him as intelligent and devoutly religious, but in the 1980s, his faith had curdled into a dangerous fanaticism. He became deeply involved with the most extreme wings of the anti-abortion movement, groups that openly advocated for violence. Within these circles, he was known by the nickname Atomic Dog. He saw himself as a soldier in a holy war. Cop was the phantom sniper. He was the one who had crisscrossed the border, stalking and shooting doctors. His attacks were painstakingly planned. He would conduct surveillance for days, learning the layout of the home, the family's routines, and the best firing position. For his final mission, he chose Dr. Barnett Slepian. In the autumn of 1998, Cop traveled to Amherst. He acquired a Chinese-made SKS semi-automatic rifle, a powerful military-grade weapon, and a scope. For several days, he surveilled the Slepian home from the dense woods that backed up to their property. He mapped out his escape route. He was patient. He was waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came on the evening of October 23, 1998. It was a Friday. The Slepian family had just returned from synagogue, where they had attended a memorial service for Dr. Slepian's father. The night was cool and clear. Inside the house, a warm, domestic scene was unfolding. Dr. Slepian, 52 years old, was in the kitchen with two of his sons, Andrew, 15, and Michael, 10. They were standing by the counter, chatting. Lynn Slepian would later recall that they were talking about what kind of soup to heat up for a late-night snack. The kitchen was brightly lit, a warm tableau visible from the darkness outside. From his position in the woods, perhaps 40 or 50 yards away, James Kopp raised his rifle. He peered through the scope, centering the crosshairs on the man in the kitchen. He was not looking at a husband or a father. He was looking at a target, a symbol of an evil he had sworn to destroy. He squeezed the trigger. A single 7.62 millimeters bullet tore through the air. It shattered the kitchen window, struck Dr. Slepian in the back, just below the shoulder blade, passed through his chest, ricocheted off the wall, and came to rest on the floor. The sound, as his son Andrew would later describe it, was like a plate shattering. For a moment there was confusion. Dr. Slepian cried out, "I've been shot!" and collapsed. His sons, who had been standing right beside him, were frozen in horror. Lynn Slepian ran into the kitchen to find her husband on the floor, bleeding profusely. The idyllic domestic scene had become a scene of unimaginable trauma. Lynn, a trained nurse, immediately began CPR. Andrew, with incredible composure for a 15-year-old who had just witnessed his father's shooting, dialed 911. The emergency call, later released, is a harrowing record of the family's terror and desperation. Andrew's voice is steady as he gives the dispatcher the address, explaining what happened. In the background, Lynn can be heard, pleading with her husband to live, counting out the chest compressions. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but the damage was done. The high-velocity round had torn through major blood vessels, including his aorta. Dr. Barnett Slepian was pronounced dead at Millard Fillmore Suburban Hospital, the very hospital where he had delivered so many babies into the world. He had been assassinated in his own home, in front of his wife and children. The murder of Dr. Slepian was not just a local crime. It was an act of domestic terrorism that sent a chill through the entire medical community. The investigation was massive, immediately involving local police, state troopers, and the FBI. The task force that had been hunting the phantom sniper now had a murder to solve. The crime scene was meticulously processed. Investigators fanned out through the woods behind the Slepian home. They found the spot where the shooter had likely stood. And, a few days later, they found the SKS rifle partially buried under some leaves. It was a crucial piece of evidence, but it offered no immediate clues to the killer's identity. The break in the case came from something almost microscopic. Near where the rifle was found, an investigator discovered a single strand of hair caught on a twig. In 1998, DNA technology was advancing rapidly. The hair was sent to the FBI's lab for analysis. Simultaneously, investigators began the painstaking work of trying to identify the rifle's owner. They traced its sale to a gun store in Ohio. The buyer had used a false name and address, but the store owner had written down the license plate number of the car he was driving. The car was a beat-up blue Chevrolet Celebrity. The license plate was registered to a woman in New York City. When the FBI questioned her, she told them that she had sold the car months earlier to a man she knew only as Jim. She said he was a pro-life activist. This was the first link between the murder weapon and the world of anti-abortion extremism. The investigation now focused on identifying Jim. Agents compiled lists of known militant activists. Meanwhile, the DNA from the hair follicle yielded a complete genetic profile. The FBI began the laborious process of trying to match that profile to known individuals, asking prominent male activists to voluntarily provide DNA samples. Most refused, but they had another lead. James Kopp had been arrested during a protest in Vermont years earlier. As part of that investigation, the FBI had subpoenaed a letter he had written. From the sealed flap of the envelope, they were able to extract a saliva sample. The DNA from that sample was a perfect match to the DNA from the hair found at the crime scene. They had their man. On May 11, 1999, the FBI issued a federal arrest warrant for James Charles Kopp for the murder of Dr. Barnett Slepian. He was officially named as the sole suspect and placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. But James Kopp was long gone. He was a ghost, an expert at living off the grid. Immediately after the murder, he had fled. He drove to Mexico. From there, using a false passport, he flew to Ireland. Kopp was not working alone. He was being aided by a clandestine network of fellow extremists, a sort of underground railroad for anti-abortion fugitives. Two key figures in this network were a New York couple named Loretta Mara and Dennis Malvesi. They wired money to Kopp in Europe, enabling him to remain at large. The international manhunt for James Kopp lasted for more than 2 years. He moved from Ireland to France, living in quiet towns, staying in cheap hotels or with sympathizers, always one step ahead of the law. The FBI, working with Interpol and European police forces, followed a trail of electronic and financial breadcrumbs. They tracked the money transfers from Mara and Malvesi. They intercepted emails. They knew he was in France, but his exact location remained a mystery. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in March 2001. An intercepted email between Kopp and his helpers revealed his location. He was in the small, historic town of Dinan, in the Brittany region of northwestern France. On March 29, 2001, a team of French commandos, acting on information from the FBI, stormed a post office where Kopp was expected to pick up a package. As he walked out, they surrounded him. James Kopp, the atomic dog, the phantom sniper, surrendered without a fight. The long, global manhunt was over. Because France has no death penalty, his extradition to the United States was contingent on prosecutors agreeing not to seek it. They agreed, and Kopp was returned to Buffalo to face justice. He would face 2 trials. A federal trial for violating the freedom of access to clinic entrances, FACE, Act, and a state trial for murder. At his federal trial, he acted as his own lawyer, turning the courtroom into a stage for his ideology. He was swiftly convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The state murder trial in 2003 was where the full human drama played out. The prosecution, led by Erie County District Attorney Frank Clark, laid out the case with chilling precision. They presented the DNA evidence, the rifle, the testimony of the gun dealer, and the story of the international manhunt. They put Lynn Slepian on the stand, who gave a heartbreaking, poised account of the night her husband was stolen from her and her children. Kopp's defense was audacious. He did not deny shooting Dr. Slepian. Instead, through his lawyers, he claimed that he had never intended to kill him. He argued that he was only trying to wound him, to decommission him, just as he had done with the other doctors. He claimed the fatal outcome was a tragic mistake. He was, he argued, guilty only of manslaughter, not murder. It was a cynical attempt to mitigate his responsibility, to frame the assassination as a well-intentioned act gone wrong. To counter this, the prosecution brought in a ballistics expert. The expert testified that the SKS rifle was a powerful, high-velocity weapon, not a tool for surgical precision. Firing it from a distance in the dark at a human target was an act of depraved indifference to human life, the legal standard for second-degree murder in New York State. The choice of weapon and the circumstances of the shooting made the outcome of death not just possible, but probable. The jury agreed. After deliberating for several hours, they rejected Kopp's claim and found him guilty of second-degree murder. At his sentencing, Kopp was finally allowed to speak at length. He delivered a long, rambling statement, showing no remorse for his actions and continuing to justify the murder by decrying abortion. The judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty, 25 years to life in prison. He would serve this sentence after completing his federal life sentence, ensuring he would die in prison. His accomplices, Loretta Mara and Dennis Malvasi, were also convicted for their role in helping him evade justice. The conviction of James Kopp brought a legal end to the case, but it could not erase the legacy of his actions. The murder of Dr. Barnett Slepian was a watershed moment. It exposed the depths of domestic terrorism fueled by ideological extremism. It forced a national conversation about the safety of medical professionals and the real-world consequences of violent rhetoric. For the Slepian family, the loss was immeasurable and permanent. Lynn Slepian became a powerful advocate for reproductive rights, speaking out against the violence and hatred that took her husband's life. The cases of Dr. Tiller and Dr. Slepian are twin tragedies, born of the same ideological war. They represent a specific, focused form of violence, where the target is chosen for what they represent. But the vulnerability of doctors is not limited to a single, polarizing issue. Sometimes, the threat comes not from a faceless sniper in the woods or a zealot in a church, but from a much more intimate place. It can emerge from the very heart of the doctor-patient relationship, when gratitude curdles into grievance, and a diagnosis is perceived not as a medical reality, but as a personal betrayal. Case 3. The murder of Dr. Michael Davidson. The threats that ended the lives of Dr. Tiller and Dr. Slepian were external, born of a national ideological schism. They were killed by strangers who saw them not as men, but as symbols in a culture war. The violence was, in its own twisted logic, impersonal. But the sanctuary of a doctor's life can be breached from a different direction entirely. The threat can arise not from a picket line or a sniper's nest, but from the quiet, intimate space of the examination room. It can be born from the very heart of the doctor-patient relationship, when the profound trust placed in a healer curdles into a fatal grievance. This is what happened on a cold winter's day in Boston, inside the walls of one of the most respected hospitals in the world. Brigham and Women's Hospital is a pillar of medicine in Boston, a sprawling campus of healing and innovation affiliated with Harvard Medical School. It is a place where the most complex medical puzzles are solved, where hope is manufactured through skill and science. Within its esteemed halls, Dr. Michael J. Davidson was a rising star. At 44 years old, he was the director of endovascular cardiac surgery, a brilliant and gifted cardiovascular surgeon known for his exceptional talent, particularly in performing complex and high-risk aortic valve replacements. He was the doctor other doctors sent their most difficult cases to. His patients were often elderly, frail, and carrying a heavy burden of comorbidities that made traditional open-heart surgery impossible. Dr. Davidson was a pioneer in minimally invasive techniques that offered them a last chance. He was known not just for his technical skill, but for his profound compassion. He possessed a warmth and an ability to connect that transcended the sterile environment of the hospital. He would spend hours with patients and their families, meticulously drawing diagrams on whiteboards, explaining intricate procedures in simple terms, ensuring they understood the risks and felt a part of the decision-making process. He treated the person, not just the ailment. His life outside the hospital was equally full. He was a devoted husband to his wife, Dr. Terry Halperin, a plastic surgeon. They had 3 young children, 2 daughters and a son, and in January of 2015, they were joyfully expecting their 4th child. He was a musician who played guitar in a band with other doctors, a man who loved to fly fish, a vibrant and cherished presence in his community of Wellesley, a prosperous Boston suburb. He was, by all accounts, a man who dedicated every facet of his life to healing and creating, to mending hearts both literally and figuratively. In the autumn of 2014, a new patient came under his care. Her name was Marguerite Passeri. She was 78 years old and had been suffering from serious cardiovascular and pulmonary problems for years. Her health was fragile, her prognosis poor. For her son, 55-year-old Stephen Passeri, his mother's well-being was his central focus. He was her primary caregiver, a deeply devoted son who managed her appointments, her medications, and every aspect of her medical journey. He was a financial planner by trade, a man who lived a quiet life in the town of Millbury, about an hour's drive from Boston. He was unmarried and lived with his parents, and after his father's passing, his bond with his mother had only intensified. When Marguerite's condition worsened, her local doctors determined her case was too risky for them to handle. They referred her to the best, Dr. Michael Davidson at Brigham and Women's. For Stephen Passeri, this referral was a lifeline. He researched Dr. Davidson and saw a surgeon with a stellar reputation, a specialist in the very kind of high-risk procedure his mother needed. In the initial consultations, Dr. Davidson did what he always did. He laid out the situation with honesty and empathy. He explained the complexity of Marguerite's condition. He detailed the proposed surgery, but he was also clear about the significant risks involved. For a patient as frail as Marguerite, even a successful surgery could be followed by a difficult and uncertain recovery. The human body, especially an aging one, can only endure so much. Stephen Passeri was present for these conversations. He absorbed the information, weighed the options, and ultimately placed his mother's life, and his own hope, in Dr. Davidson's hands. In November 2014, Dr. Davidson performed the valve replacement surgery on Marguerite Passeri. From a technical standpoint, the procedure itself went well. But as Dr. Davidson had cautioned, the aftermath was challenging. Marguerite's recovery was fraught with complications. Her frail body struggled to rebound from the trauma of the surgery. A few weeks later, on November 15th, Marguerite Passeri passed away. For the medical staff, her death, while tragic, was an understood and accepted risk of a life-saving procedure on a critically ill patient. It was a sad outcome, but not an unexpected one. It was not the result of a mistake or negligence. It was the result of a body succumbing to its underlying, long-standing illnesses, despite the best efforts of medicine. But for Stephen Passeri, this clinical reality was impossible to accept. His grief was immense, but it did not follow a normal path. It twisted and warped into something else entirely, a venomous, all-consuming obsession. In his mind, his mother's death was not a tragic outcome. It was a crime, and the perpetrator was Dr. Michael Davidson. He began to construct a narrative of blame. He fixated on the post-operative medications his mother had been prescribed, particularly the blood thinner warfarin. It's a common and necessary medication after such procedures, but it carries its own set of risks and requires careful management. In Passeri's distorted view, this medication was not a part of the treatment. It was the weapon. He began to believe that Dr. Davidson had intentionally or negligently prescribed the wrong dosage, causing his mother's death. He saw a conspiracy where there was only complication, malice where there was only medicine. His grief had found a target, and it gave his pain a purpose. He was no longer just a grieving son. He was an avenger seeking justice for his murdered mother. He began to plan. This was not a sudden, impulsive act of rage. It was a deliberate, methodical slide into violence. He legally owned firearms. He kept them secured in his home. In the weeks leading up to January 2015, his behavior grew more erratic, though much of his internal turmoil was hidden from the outside world. He sent a package to his sister containing his mother's jewelry and other sentimental items. He left notes. He settled his affairs. He was preparing for a final, terrible act. On Tuesday, January 20th, 2015, Stephen Passeri drove from his home in Millbury to Boston. The weather was cold, the sky a flat, winter gray. He arrived at the Shapiro Cardiovascular Center, the gleaming, modern heart of Brigham and Women's Hospital. He walked into the lobby, a space designed to be calming and hopeful. He was not dressed in tactical gear or shouting slogans. He was a middle-aged man in a winter coat, indistinguishable from any other patient or family member. He went to the information desk on the second floor and asked to see Dr. Michael Davidson. He did not have an appointment, but he gave his name. It was a name the staff recognized. He was the son of a recent patient who had passed away. It was not unusual for grieving family members to return to the hospital, seeking answers, closure, or simply a final conversation with the doctor who had cared for their loved one. Compassion is the default setting in such an environment. A message was relayed to Dr. Davidson. Dr. Davidson was between surgeries. He was busy, but he was never too busy for a family in pain. Believing a grieving son needed to talk, he agreed to meet with Passeri. He told his staff he would be back in a few minutes. It was a decision rooted in the empathy that defined him. He led Stephen Passeri away from the public waiting area and into the privacy of examination room 15. It was a small, standard room, a space for consultation and healing. The door closed. What happened next is known only through the chilling finality of the outcome. Passeri confronted the doctor. It is believed he accused Davidson directly, perhaps shouting the words he had been rehearsing in his mind for weeks. "You killed my mother." Then he pulled out a .40 caliber handgun. He fired 2 shots. Both bullets struck Dr. Davidson in the torso. The sound of the gunshots was shocking, utterly alien in the hushed, sterile corridors of the cardiac center. Passeri then turned the gun on himself. He fired a single, fatal shot into his own head. Outside the exam room, chaos erupted. Staff and patients, hearing the shots, scrambled for cover. A code black, the hospital's signal for a shooter or hostage situation, was issued, and the sprawling hospital went into lockdown. Police and SWAT teams swarmed the building, sweeping through the floors, unsure of the scale of the threat. They found the 2 men in the exam room. Passeri was dead. Dr. Davidson was alive, but his wounds were mortal. In a scene of devastating irony, the surgeon known for saving lives was now the one desperately needing to be saved. His own colleagues, the nurses and doctors who had worked alongside him just moments before, rushed him to the emergency room. They were now fighting to save their friend, their mentor. They cracked open his chest and performed emergency surgery right there in the trauma bay, doing everything humanly and medically possible to mend the damage. But the injuries were too severe. The bullets had ravaged his internal organs. After hours of heroic effort, Dr. Michael Davidson was pronounced dead. The news of his murder sent a tidal wave of shock and grief through Boston and the international medical community. This was not like the other cases. Dr. Davidson was not a controversial figure. He was not a symbol in a culture war. He was a healer universally admired and loved, murdered not for his beliefs, but for a successful high-risk surgery that had an unfortunate but medically understandable outcome. The investigation quickly pieced together Stephen Passeri's motive. They found a note in his home that laid out his distorted thinking, his unshakable belief that Dr. Davidson was responsible for his mother's death. It was a clear case of murder-suicide, born from a toxic combination of grief, mental distress, and a profound inability to accept the limits of medicine. The murder of Dr. Davidson exposed a different, more insidious vulnerability for physicians. It highlighted the terrifying possibility that any patient or any patient's family member could become a threat. It raised a chilling question for every doctor. How do you protect yourself from the very people you are trying to help? The act of compassion that led Dr. Davidson into that exam room was the very act that made him vulnerable. His murder was a direct assault on the trust that forms the bedrock of medical care. In the aftermath, the hospital increased security, installing metal detectors and adding more police presence. But many knew that these were imperfect solutions to a problem that was fundamentally human. How can a metal detector screen for a broken heart or a mind warped by grief? The deepest tragedy, of course, was for the Davidson family. A fund was established for his children's education, and donations poured in from around the world. A few months after his murder, his wife, Terry Halperin, gave birth to their 4th child. a baby girl named Michaela. She was a new life born into the shadow of an immense loss, a living testament to the future that had been stolen. Dr. Davidson was killed because of a grievance, a personal vendetta rooted in a tragic medical outcome. The motive was intensely private, a closed loop of pain between the doctor and the patient's son. But doctors can also become targets for reasons that have nothing to do with ideology or the outcome of a procedure. They can be targeted simply for who they are, successful, respected figures who, in the eyes of the desperate or the greedy, represent an opportunity. Their status, meant to signify trust and achievement, can be twisted into a liability, making them a mark for a crime as old as society itself: extortion. This was the motive that would bring tragedy to a celebrated surgical pioneer on the other side of the world. Case 4. The killing of Dr. Victor Chong. The motives for targeting a doctor can be ideological, as with Dr. Tiller and Dr. Slepian, or they can be intensely personal, as in the tragic case of Dr. Davidson. The violence in those instances is rooted in a belief system or a specific painful grievance. But sometimes the reason is far more primal, stripped of any complex justification. Sometimes a doctor is targeted not for what they do or what they represent, but simply for what they have. Their success, a symbol of their dedication and skill, becomes a beacon for desperation and greed. This was the tragedy that befell a national hero in Sydney, Australia, a man whose hands had saved thousands, only to be slain for the contents of his wallet. In the late 20th century, few names in Australia commanded as much respect and admiration as Dr. Victor Chong. He was more than a doctor. He was a national icon, a symbol of the promise of modern medicine and the success of multicultural Australia. Born in Shanghai in 1936, he and his family fled to Hong Kong during the Sino-Japanese War. Tragedy struck early when his mother died of breast cancer, an event that ignited in the young Chong a burning ambition to pursue a career in medicine, to fight the diseases that had stolen his mother from him. He moved to Australia as a young man to study, graduating from the University of Sydney with a degree in medicine and surgery. He trained further in the United Kingdom and the United States, working alongside pioneers in cardiovascular surgery, before returning to Australia in the 1970s. He brought with him a formidable skill set and a revolutionary vision for cardiac care. At St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, he established the National Cardiac Transplant Unit, a world-class center that would transform the lives of countless patients. Dr. Chong was a pioneer of the artificial heart valve and a leader in the field of heart and lung transplantation. Under his leadership, St. Vincent's became one of the most successful transplant centers on the planet. He and his team performed hundreds of successful heart transplants, giving years of life to people who had been given none. He was brilliant, charismatic, and tirelessly dedicated. He was named Australian of the Year in 1986, and his work was recognized with Australia's highest honor, the Companion of the Order of Australia. He was a celebrity in the truest sense of the word, celebrated not for being famous but for doing good. He was a husband and a father to 2 children, living a comfortable but not extravagant life in the affluent Sydney suburb of Mosman. He was, to the Australian public, a living saint. But in the sprawling, anonymous metropolis of Sydney, other lives were unfolding along a much darker trajectory. 2 men, both Malaysian nationals, found themselves caught in a spiral of debt and failure. The first was Chu Sang Liu, a man in his late 60s who went by Ah Sung. He was a cook and a small-time businessman whose ventures had consistently failed. He was in deep financial trouble, with mounting debts from a failed restaurant in Kuala Lumpur. The second man was Philip Choon T. Lim, 33 years old. Lim had come to Australia a few years earlier with aspirations of making his fortune. Instead, he found himself working low-wage jobs, and his attempts to launch a business selling satellite dishes had collapsed, leaving him nearly bankrupt and desperate. The 2 men knew each other through Sydney's Malaysian community. They were bound by a shared language and a shared sense of failure. Sometime in 1991, their desperation coalesced into a criminal enterprise. They decided that the quickest way out of their financial hole was extortion. They needed a target, someone wealthy enough to pay a large sum of money, yet perhaps vulnerable enough to be intimidated. They began searching for a victim. Their initial plan was to target a foreign businessman, believing that such a person might be less likely to go to the police. They bought a car, a gold-colored Nissan Pulsar, and began conducting surveillance in Sydney's wealthy eastern suburbs. They spent weeks looking for a suitable mark, but their efforts were clumsy and fruitless. They were amateurs playing a dangerous game. Then, their focus shifted. They began reading Sydney's popular society magazines, publications that detailed the lives of the rich and famous. In the glossy pages, they found their target, Dr. Victor Chong. The articles painted a picture of a successful, celebrated, and presumably wealthy man. They saw his photo, read about his home in Mossman, and learned about his daily routine. In their minds, a plan began to form, a plan that was as crude as it was cruel. They would kidnap Dr. Chong. They would force him into their car, take him to a safe house, and force him to call his family to arrange a ransom payment. They demanded a sum of $3 million Australian dollars. It was a classic tiger kidnapping, a common crime in parts of Asia, but their understanding of it was based on movies and stories, not experience. They began their surveillance of Dr. Chong. They learned he drove a dark Mercedes-Benz sedan. They followed him from his home to the hospital. They learned his route. They were two shadows haunting the life of a man who spent his days in the spotlight. They acquired 2 handguns, cheap pistols that would become the instruments of a national tragedy. The plan was set for the morning of Thursday, July 4, 1991. The weather in Sydney was miserable cold, wet, and windy. Dr. Chong, 54 years old, left his home in Mossman shortly before 8:30 a.m. He was scheduled to give a lecture that morning. He was running a little late. As he drove his Mercedes along Military Road, a main thoroughfare, he would not have noticed the gold Nissan Pulsar that pulled out and began to follow him. Inside the Pulsar were Liu and Lim. Their intent was to somehow force Dr. Chong to pull over, get him out of his car, and into theirs. Their method for achieving this was dangerously ill-conceived. As Dr. Chang's car approached the intersection of Military Road and Spit Road, Lim, who was driving the Pulsar, intentionally collided with the back of the Mercedes. It was not a hard crash, just a fender bender, the kind of minor accident that happens every day in a busy city. It was their way of initiating contact. Dr. Chong pulled over to the side of the road to inspect the damage and exchange information, as any law-abiding citizen would. But something about the situation must have felt wrong. Perhaps it was the demeanor of the 2 men, their nervousness, their intensity. Dr. Chong, an intelligent and perceptive man, likely sensed that this was no ordinary traffic accident. He got back into his car. What happened next was a slow-motion chase through the suburban streets of Mossman. Dr. Chong did not speed away recklessly. Instead, he drove carefully, perhaps trying to get to a safer, more public location, or perhaps trying to find a police station. The gold Pulsar followed him, sticking close behind. For several minutes, the 2 cars weaved through the quiet, residential streets. Dr. Chong eventually turned onto Marie Street, a small side street just a block from his own home. He stopped his car. The Pulsar pulled up alongside him. The decision to stop there remains a point of speculation. Perhaps he thought he could reason with them. Perhaps he recognized he couldn't shake them and decided a confrontation was inevitable. Liu got out of the passenger side of the Pulsar and walked over to the driver's side of the Mercedes. An argument erupted in the street. Witnesses peering out of their windows on the rainy morning would later describe a heated exchange. Liu, holding a pistol, was trying to force Dr. Chong out of his car and over to the Pulsar. Dr. Chong refused. He was not a man easily intimidated. He argued back, his voice raised. He was fighting for his life, not with a scalpel, but with words. The confrontation escalated. Liu, growing more agitated and frustrated, was losing control. The simple plan was falling apart. This celebrated doctor was not complying. He was resisting. In his panic, Liu fired a warning shot. The bullet discharged into the ground, a loud crack that shattered the morning quiet. But it did not have the intended effect. Dr. Chong continued to struggle. Then you fired a second shot. This one was not a warning. The bullet struck Dr. Victor Chang in the right cheek, traveled through his head, and severed his brainstem. He collapsed onto the roadway next to his car. The killing was instant. Panic consumed the two would-be kidnappers. Their high-stakes extortion plot had devolved into a street-side murder. They jumped back into their pulsar and sped away, leaving the body of Australia's most beloved doctor lying in the rain on a quiet suburban street. Their grand plan had netted them nothing. They had not taken his wallet, his watch, or his car. They had only taken his life. The discovery of Dr. Chang's body sent a seismic shockwave through Australia. The news was met with disbelief, which quickly turned to a national outpouring of grief and rage. Who would do such a thing? The initial speculation ran wild. Was it the Chinese triads seeking revenge for some unknown slight? Was it a professional, contract killing? The motive seemed incomprehensible. Police launched one of the largest investigations in the state's history, a task force codenamed Operation Sestro. The investigation was methodical. Police canvassed the neighborhood, gathering witness statements. Several people had seen the argument, seen the gold pulsar, and could provide descriptions of the two men. But the most crucial early clue came from the crime scene itself. In the gutter near Dr. Chang's body, police found a small, white business card holder. Inside was a piece of paper, a note written in Chinese characters. It was a demand for payment from a restaurant where Liu had worked, a debt he owed. It was a link, a thread connecting the crime to one of its perpetrators. The car was the next key. The description of the gold Nissan Pulsar was broadcast widely. A car matching the description was soon found abandoned. Inside, police found more evidence linking it to the failed extortion plot. The net was beginning to tighten, but the suspects had vanished. The real breakthrough came from an informant. A man in Malaysia who knew Liu and Lim heard about the murder in Sydney. He knew of their financial troubles and their desperate schemes. He contacted the Malaysian police, who in turn alerted the Australian authorities. He provided them with names, Chusing Liu and Philip Chun T. Lim. The international manhunt was on. Police discovered that Lim had already fled Australia, flying back to Malaysia just days after the murder. Liu had gone to ground, hiding within Sydney's Malaysian community. Using information from their informant, police tracked Liu to a house in the suburb of Lakemba. On July 16, 12 days after the murder, police raided the home and arrested him. He surrendered meekly. A few days later, acting on a request from Australia, Malaysian police located and arrested Philip Lim in Kuala Lumpur. He was extradited back to Australia to face justice. The trials of Liu and Lim captivated the nation. The prosecution, using the evidence from the crime scene, the witness testimony, and confessions the two men had made to police, laid out the story of the inept and tragic extortion plot. They painted a picture of two desperate men whose greed and incompetence led directly to the death of a great man. The defense strategies were different. Lim claimed that while he was part of the plan, he was just the driver and was shocked when Liu fired the gun. Liu's story changed multiple times. At one point, he claimed the gun went off accidentally during the struggle. Then, he tried to claim that he was not the shooter at all, but that a third, mysterious man was responsibly a claim the jury dismissed as fantasy. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Both men were found guilty. Philip Lim was convicted of murder under the principle of joint criminal enterprise, as he was a willing participant in the felony that led to the death. He was sentenced to a maximum of 24 years in prison. Chu Sang Liu, the shooter, was also convicted of murder and sentenced to 26 years. The sentences were met with some public outcry, with many feeling they were too lenient for the killing of a national treasure. But the legal process was complete. The motive was laid bare, not as a grand conspiracy, but as a sordid and pathetic attempt to get money. Dr. Victor Chang was killed because his name was in a magazine, because he looked wealthy, and because two desperate men thought he would be an easy mark. They were wrong. The legacy of Dr. Victor Chang, however, would not be defined by the squalor of his death. It would be defined by the brilliance of his life. In 1994, the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute was established in his honor. It has become one of the most respected centers for heart research in the world, a testament to his vision. Through the work of the Institute, Dr. Chang's mission to fight heart disease continues. The hands of the healer were stilled on that rainy morning in Mossman, but his spirit, embodied in the institute that bears his name, continues to save lives, a powerful and enduring legacy that 1,000 bullets could never extinguish. The stories of these four doctors, Tiller, Slepian, Davidson, and Chong are a somber mosaic of tragedy. They were targeted for different reasons. For ideology, for grievance, for greed. Yet they are bound by a common, chilling thread. They were murdered because they were healers, symbols of trust in a world that can be dangerously untrusting. Their deaths are a stark reminder that the spaces we deem sanctuaries are fragile, and the people we entrust with our lives are sometimes forced to risk their own. Their dedication and their loss leave an indelible mark on the moral landscape, asking a quiet, lingering question about the price of compassion. Sleep well. Good evening and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We gather here once more, not for comfort, but for understanding to look into the shadows of human nature. Tonight, we delve into the heart of a primal and terrifying force, fire. But not fire as a natural disaster. We explore fire as a weapon wielded by hands filled with rage, jealousy, or a chilling emptiness. We will walk through the ashes of 4 tragedies, each ignited by a single, deliberate act of arson. This is the story of the fire starter's fury and the lives it consumed in its unforgiving blaze. Case 1. The Happy Land Social Club Fire. Our story begins in the Bronx, New York, on the night of Saturday, March 24, 1990. The air is still cool with the lingering memory of winter, but inside a modest, 2-story building at 1959 Southern Boulevard, the atmosphere is electric. This is the Happy Land Social Club. It is an unlicensed establishment, a place that exists in the gray areas of city regulations, but to its patrons it is a vibrant sanctuary. It is a slice of home for the Honduran immigrant community, a place where the rhythms of salsa and merengue drown out the struggles of life in a new country. The music is loud, the laughter is genuine, and the dance floor is a swirl of color and movement. On this particular night, the club is celebrating Carnival. The energy is infectious, a collective release of joy and cultural pride. Among the crowd is Lydia Feliciano. She works the coat check counter, a small but essential post near the club's single entrance. It is a job that places her at the nexus of the club's social life, greeting familiar faces, taking their jackets, and watching the joyful chaos unfold. But tonight, her view is interrupted by an unwelcome presence. Her former boyfriend, Julio Gonzalez. Their relationship had ended, but Julio refused to accept it. He was a man consumed by a possessive jealousy, a quiet intensity that could quickly curdle into rage. He had come to the club not to celebrate, but to reclaim what he believed was his. He approaches Lydia, his words a low, insistent plea for her to come back to him. Lydia, tired of the cycle of arguments and control, refuses. She is firm. It is over. Julio's pleading sharpens into anger. His voice rises, cutting through the music. The confrontation escalates. The bouncer, a man named Mario, intervenes. He tells Julio to leave, to respect Lydia's wishes. But Julio, fueled by rejection and wounded pride, becomes belligerent. He shouts, he threatens. He is physically removed from the club, pushed out onto the cold sidewalk of Southern Boulevard. As the door closes behind him, separating him from the warmth, the music, and the woman who has rejected him, Julio shouts a final, chilling promise into the night. Witnesses would later recall his words, some variation of, "You'll see. I'm coming back. I'm going to shut this place down." The threat hangs in the air for a moment, then dissipates, dismissed by the bouncers as the empty bluster of a spurned lover. Inside, the music swells again, and the party continues, oblivious to the fury that had just been unleashed on the street. But Julio Gonzalez's rage was not empty. It was a cold, methodical thing that now had a singular purpose. He walked away from the club, but not toward home. He did not go to a bar to drink away his anger. His steps were deliberate. He walked a few blocks to a nearby Amaco gas station. The attendant on duty, a man named Musa, would later remember the transaction. It was unremarkable, mundane. A man came in and asked for $1 worth of gasoline. Musa filled a small, clear plastic container with the fuel. $1. A trivial amount, enough to fill a lawnmower, or in this case, enough to become the catalyst for a massacre. Julio took the container and walked back toward the Happy Land Social Club. The liquid sloshed with each step, a small, contained ocean of potential destruction. He did not hesitate. He did not reconsider. When he arrived back at the club, the party was still in full swing. The sounds of life and laughter spilled out into the street. For a moment, 2 worlds existed side by side, the vibrant, living world inside, and the cold, vengeful world of the man standing outside with a container of gasoline. Julio unscrewed the cap. With a sweeping motion, he doused the single doorway, the only way in and the only way out. He splashed the fuel on the stairs leading down into the club on the worn wooden threshold. The acrid smell of gasoline instantly permeated the air. Then he lit a match. The ignition was instantaneous, a violent, explosive whoosh. A curtain of fire erupted, sealing the entrance. The flames, fed by the gasoline, climbed the walls with ferocious speed. They were an impenetrable wall of heat and smoke. Julio Gonzalez watched for a few seconds as his fury took physical form, then he turned and walked away into the night, leaving behind a scene that would, in moments, become one of the deadliest fires in New York City's history. Inside the club, confusion turned to panic in a heartbeat. The music stopped. A wave of thick, black, toxic smoke rolled through the venue. The fire alarm, which the building was required to have, did not sound. There were no sprinklers to quell the initial blaze. The lights went out, plunging the club into a terrifying, suffocating darkness. The single exit was now a roaring furnace. There was no escape. The layout of the club became a death trap. It was a two-level establishment. The main dance floor and bar were on the second floor, accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase from the ground-level entrance. There was no back door. There were no fire escapes. The windows were barred or blocked. The patrons, blinded and choking, scrambled in the dark, desperate for a way out. They pushed toward the front, only to be met with an impassable wall of flames. They turned and ran deeper into the club, searching for another exit, another chance, but there was none. The scene, as later described by the first responders who would have to bear witness to it, was apocalyptic. In their final moments, people had piled on top of one another, overcome by carbon monoxide poisoning. They were found huddled in corners, in the bathrooms, under tables, anywhere they thought they might find a pocket of clean air. The joyous celebration had transformed into a tomb. The first 911 call came in at 3:40 a.m. The firehouse for Engine 88 and Ladder 38 was just a block and a half away. They arrived in less than a minute. What they saw was a building consumed by fire, with thick, black smoke billowing from the entrance. They knew immediately it was a major incident. They tried to enter, but the heat was so intense it drove them back. It was like trying to enter a blast furnace. Firefighters began a coordinated, desperate attack. They poured water onto the blaze, trying to cool it enough to make entry. When they finally broke through, the fire was mostly out, extinguished by its own consumption of all available oxygen. They stepped into a scene of unimaginable horror. The heat had been so extreme that it had melted plastics and buckled steel. But it was the human toll that was breathtaking. The bodies were everywhere. On the second floor, they were layered 2 and 3 deep near where the staircase would have been. Young men and women, dressed for a night of dancing, were frozen in their final, desperate postures. Many were found with their hands outstretched, as if still reaching for a door that wasn't there. The final count was staggering. 87 people were dead. They were sons, daughters, mothers, and fathers. Most were under the age of 25. They were people who had come to America in search of a better life, only to have it stolen from them in a matter of minutes, all because of one man's wounded ego. Only a handful of people survived, including Lydia Feliciano, the coat check girl, and a few others who were near the entrance and were pulled out by rescuers in the initial moments. The investigation began almost immediately amidst the smoldering ruins. The cause was not a mystery for long. The overwhelming smell of gasoline pointed directly to arson. And the primary witness, a traumatized but lucid Lydia Feliciano, gave investigators their only suspect, Julio Gonzalez. She told them about the argument, his threats, his forced removal from the club. Her testimony was the crucial link. A massive manhunt was launched. Police broadcast Julio's name and description. They knew he couldn't have gone far. The next afternoon, just over 12 hours after he lit the match, detectives found him. He was at a relative's house, asleep. When they arrested him, he was reportedly calm, almost detached. He smelled faintly of gasoline. He offered a confession that was chilling in its simplicity. He admitted to the fight, to buying the gasoline, to starting the fire. His motive? He claimed he was angry and that the devil had gotten into his head. But his actions spoke not of demonic possession, but of a very human and very petty form of evil. He told detectives he thought the club would be empty by the time he returned, that he only meant to scare Lydia, to burn the building down as a final act of spurned dominance. The jury and the city would not believe him. The legal process was swift. Julio Gonzalez was charged with 174 counts of murder, 2 for each victim, representing 2 legal theories. murder with depraved indifference to human life, and felony murder, which holds a person responsible for any deaths that occur during the commission of another felony, in this case arson. He was also charged with arson, assault, and reckless endangerment. His trial was a somber affair. The prosecution laid out the case with methodical precision. They presented the testimony of the gas station attendant, the survivors, and the bouncer. They presented Julio's own confession. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue that he did not intend to kill anyone, that it was an act of passion that went horribly wrong. But the act of pouring gasoline on the only exit of a crowded, windowless nightclub could not be interpreted as anything other than an act of mass murder. On August 19, 1991, Julio Gonzalez was found guilty on all counts. At his sentencing, the judge delivered a sentence that reflected the magnitude of his crime. For each of the 87 victims, he was sentenced to the maximum, 25 years to life. The judge ordered the sentences to be served consecutively, creating a symbolic term of over 2,000 years. It was a clear message that Julio Gonzalez would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. He would die there in 2016, at the age of 61, from a heart attack, having served 26 years for his crime. But the story of the Happy Land fire does not end with the conviction of its perpetrator. The tragedy cast a harsh light on the systemic failures that made such a loss of life possible. The club was operating illegally. It had been ordered to close by the city months earlier for numerous fire code violations: no sprinklers, no secondary exits, inadequate lighting, and flammable decorations. The owner, Elias Colon, had simply ignored the order, removed the closure sign from the door, and continued to operate. In the aftermath, there was a surge of public outrage. The city of New York formed a task force that cracked down on thousands of illegal social clubs, shutting down hundreds that posed a fire hazard. Fire safety laws were strengthened. The tragedy became a brutal, but necessary, catalyst for change, ensuring that the conditions that created the Happy Land death trap would not be so easily replicated. The Happy Land social club fire remains a deep scar on the psyche of the Bronx. It was not just a crime, it was a devastating blow to an entire community. It was a story of immigration, of people seeking joy and connection in a foreign land. It was a story of regulatory failure, of a system that looked the other way while a disaster was waiting to happen. And at its dark heart, it was the story of a single, toxic obsession. A story of how one man's rage, born from a simple rejection on a dance floor, could be magnified by $1 worth of gasoline and a building with no escape, resulting in an inferno that consumed 87 lives and left a community forever changed by the fury of a fire starter. The vacant lot where the club once stood is now a quiet memorial, a place of remembrance for the vibrant souls who danced there on their final night. Case 2. The Upstairs Lounge Arson Attack. We leave the ashes of the Bronx and travel back in time, to the humid, languid air of New Orleans, on Sunday, June 24, 1973. In the heart of the French Quarter, at the corner of Chartres and Iberville streets, a different kind of sanctuary existed. Up a long, narrow wooden staircase, on the second floor of a 3-story building, was the Upstairs Lounge. To a tourist, it might have seemed like just another nondescript bar. But to the city's gay community, it was a lifeline. In an era when their existence was criminalized, condemned, and often met with violence, the Upstairs Lounge was a haven of radical acceptance. It was a place of faded glamour, with red flock wallpaper, a baby grand piano in the corner, and a small stage draped with curtains. It was more than a bar. It was a community center, a town hall, a place where people could shed the suffocating masks they wore in their daily lives. Here they could be themselves, love freely, and find fellowship without fear. This sense of sanctuary was so profound that the local congregation of the Metropolitan Community Church, or MCC, often held its services there. The MCC was one of the first Christian denominations to openly welcome LGBTQ+ members. And on this Sunday, the lounge had been transformed into a place of worship. After the service, the atmosphere was one of quiet joy and relief. The MCC had just held a successful fundraiser. About 60 people remained gathered in celebration. Reverend William R. Larson, the local MCC pastor, was there. At the piano, a man named David Stewart Gary played show tunes and the patrons sang along. The song that filled the air just before the tragedy was the theme from the musical Free, a poignant anthem of hope and liberation. The windows were open to the warm night, and the sounds of laughter and music drifted down to the street below. Inside the upstairs lounge, for this brief, precious moment, the world felt safe. But this safety was an illusion, fragile and soon to be shattered. Among the patrons earlier that day had been a man named Roger Dale Nunez. Nunez was a troubled individual known for being disruptive and often hustling other men for drinks and money. On this particular day, he had been involved in a scuffle and argument with another patron. He was ejected from the bar, forced back down the steep staircase and out onto the street. Like Julio Gonzalez in our previous story, rejection festered into a homicidal rage. Witnesses later reported seeing Nunez muttering angrily to himself as he was thrown out. Shortly before 8 p.m., the doorbell at the street-level entrance to the lounge buzzed. This was the only way to get in. The door was always kept locked for security. Someone inside, likely thinking it was a late-coming friend or a taxi driver, opened it. In that instant, a fireball erupted up the staircase. The arsonist had poured lighter fluid, a common accelerant, in the wooden steps and ignited it. The narrow stairwell, enclosed and made of old, dry wood, acted as a chimney. The flames shot upwards with explosive force, a roaring torrent of fire and superheated gas. The joyful singing inside the lounge turned into screams of terror. The fire alarm, which had been disconnected, remained silent. The fire blocked the only clearly marked exit. A wall of black, acrid smoke, thick with the chemicals from the burning carpet and wallpaper, instantly filled the room. Panic erupted in the pitch-black darkness. People were blinded, choking, disoriented. They stumbled over furniture and each other, desperately searching for a way out. The building's layout was a death trap. The windows that faced Iberville Street were covered with heavy metal bars installed years ago to prevent burglary. They were impenetrable. The patrons clawed at them, their hands burning on the superheated metal, but it was useless. On the other side of the room, 3 large windows faced Chartres Street, but one was blocked by an air conditioning unit and the other 2 were boarded up or partially obstructed. A few managed to find a path to these windows. A man named Buddy Rasmussen, the MCC's assistant pastor, successfully squeezed his body through a narrow 30-inch gap in one of the blocked windows and dropped to the roof of a neighboring building below. He turned back, his face blackened with soot, and tried to help others. He reached for his partner, Adam Fontenot, but Adam slipped and fell back into the inferno. Reverend Bill Larson also made it to a window. He managed to crawl through, but then he turned back. His partner, and his life's love, was still inside. He went back into the consuming blackness to find him. Firefighters would later find Reverend Larson's charred body, fused to the metal bars of a window, his arms outstretched as if in a final, desperate plea for deliverance. The New Orleans Fire Department arrived within minutes, but they were met with a scene of pure horror. Flames were jetting from the second-story windows. They could hear the screams from inside and see the silhouettes of people pressed against the barred windows, trapped. Firefighter Bob Lee would later recall seeing a man's body burning in one of the windows, like a torch. The heat was so intense it forced the firefighters back. When they were finally able to enter the lounge, the scene was beyond comprehension. The fire had consumed everything, leaving behind a monochrome landscape of ash and ruin. And amidst the debris, they found the bodies. 32 people had died. Some were so badly burned they were unrecognizable, reduced to charred remains. They were found huddled together, under tables, near the piano, and stacked in a heartbreaking pile against the barred windows they could not breach. One victim was found with his head pushed through the bars, trapped, having suffocated from the smoke while his body burned. The upstairs lounge, a place of sanctuary, had become a crematorium. The fire itself was a horrific tragedy. But what followed in the days and weeks after was a second, colder tragedy, one of societal indifference, cruelty, and profound homophobia. This, in many ways, is the darkest part of the upstairs lounge story. The official response was appallingly muted. Mayor Moon Landrieu did not issue a public statement for days. The city's political and religious leaders remained largely silent. The police investigation was, by most accounts, cursory and half-hearted. It was treated not as a mass murder of citizens but as an internal problem within a deviant community. The prevailing attitude seemed to be that the victims had brought it upon themselves. This cruelty was reflected in the media coverage. One local radio host joked on air about the fire, quipping that they would have to bury the bodies in fruit jars. Newspaper reports were clinical at best and often derogatory, referring to the victims as inmates of a dive and thieves and lawbreakers. The human element was stripped away, replaced by coded language that delegitimized their lives and their deaths. This societal shunning extended even to the families of the victims. In 1973, many of the victims were not openly gay to their families or employers. The fire threatened to posthumously out them. Several families, out of shame or fear, refused to claim the bodies of their own sons. For bodies remained unidentified and were eventually buried in a mass grave in the city's paupers' field, their identities lost to history. The surviving community was left to grieve in isolation. Mainstream churches refused to hold memorial services. Reverend Troy Perry, the national founder of the MCC, flew to New Orleans to offer support. He tried to organize a prayer service, but church after church turned him away. Finally, a small Methodist church and a Unitarian church agreed to host memorials. But even these services were fraught with fear. Attendees were terrified of being photographed by the media, which had gathered outside, not to report on the grief, but to potentially expose the identities of those who mourned. They were forced to enter and exit through side doors and back alleys, hiding their faces, grieving for their friends in the shadows. The investigation into the arson quickly focused on Roger Dale Nunez, the man who had been thrown out of the bar. The evidence against him was compelling. Multiple witnesses placed him at the scene, acting erratically. He had a history of violence and instability. A taxi driver told police he had picked up a distraught Nunez near the French Quarter shortly after the fire started. During the ride, Nunez allegedly confessed, talking about burning the queers. Police did bring Nunez in for questioning. He was given a lie detector test, which sources say he failed. And yet, for reasons that remain unclear and deeply frustrating, he was released. No charges were ever filed against him. The police claimed there was not enough evidence to secure a conviction. A year and a half after the fire, in November 1974, Roger Dale Nunez died by suicide. His death effectively closed the case for the New Orleans Police Department. The arson that killed 32 people was, and technically remains, an unsolved crime. There was no trial, no conviction, no public accounting for the act of mass murder. Justice was never served. For decades, the story of the upstairs lounge was largely forgotten by mainstream America, a historical footnote whispered only within the LGBTQ+ community. It was a trauma too deep, and for the outside world, too inconvenient to remember. It stood as the deadliest attack on a gay gathering place in U.S. history until the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016. The legacy of the upstairs lounge is a complex one. It is a story of unimaginable loss and profound grief, but it is also a story of the terrifying consequences of hatred and bigotry. The fire was lit by one man's hand, but the fuel was a society that deemed the people inside as less than human. The true horror lies not only in the flames that consumed their bodies, but in the cold silence and contempt that desecrated their memory. The fire on Iberville Street was an act of annihilation, an attempt to erase a community. But memory is resilient, and in remembering the 32 souls lost that night, we bear witness not only to their tragic end, but to the lives they lived and the sanctuary they sought, in a world that offered them none. Case 3, the John or Pillow Pyro case. From the overt, explosive rage of our first two cases, we now turn to a far more insidious and perplexing form of pyromania. Our story moves to Southern California in the 1980s and early 1990s, a region plagued by a series of mysterious and devastating fires. These were not concentrated in a single building or neighborhood. They were scattered across cities like Glendale, Burbank, and Pasadena. They erupted in retail stores during business hours and craft shops, fabric stores, and hardware stores, sending panicked shoppers and employees fleeing for their lives. The fires were baffling investigators. They started small, often in displays of flammable materials like foam pillows, wicker baskets, or polyester fabrics, and then grew with terrifying speed. There was no obvious cause, no faulty wiring, no careless smoker. It was clear they were the work of an arsonist, but this arsonist was a ghost. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no discernible motive beyond a pure, unadulterated desire to watch things burn. This arsonist was prolific, intelligent, and chillingly patient. He developed a signature device, a simple yet diabolically effective incendiary tool. It consisted of a cigarette, typically a Virginia Slims, with 3 matches wrapped around it by a rubber band. The cigarette would be lit and placed within a combustible item like a bag of potato chips or a piece of paper. The slow-burning cigarette acted as a time delay fuse. It would smolder for 15 to 20 minutes, giving the arsonist ample time to leave the store and be miles away before the cigarette burned down to the match heads. When the ember reached the matches, they would ignite, setting fire to the surrounding material. It was a cheap, disposable, and nearly untraceable method for starting a fire. For years, this phantom arsonist terrorized Southern California. The fires caused millions of dollars in damages, destroyed businesses, and created a pervasive sense of anxiety. But the most significant fire, the one that elevated this case from a series of destructive pranks to a mass casualty event, occurred on the afternoon of October 10, 1984. The target was an Olds Home Center in South Pasadena. The store was bustling with customers and employees. The arsonist, moving unseen through the aisles, placed one of his signature devices in the pillow and bedding section. The flammable polyurethane foam ignited and the fire spread with an almost unbelievable velocity. A massive plume of thick, toxic black smoke quickly filled the vast, warehouse-like store. The fire grew so hot it caused a flashover, an event where the contents of an entire space simultaneously erupt in flames. The roof collapsed. The building was completely consumed. In the chaos, most people managed to escape. But 4 did not. An employee, 26-year-old Carolyn Krause, and 3 customers, 50-year-old Elizabeth Horn, 17-year-old Jimmy Sedina, and his 2-year-old grandson, Matthew Troidel, were trapped and killed. Their deaths transformed the investigation. This was no longer just property damage, it was murder. Investigators from across the region were stumped. They had a string of fires with a clear, shared methodology, but no suspects. They convened a conference in 1987 in Fresno, bringing together arson investigators from across the state to share information and brainstorm new strategies. They called themselves the Pillow Pyrans after the arsonist's penchant for starting fires in foam pillows. They analyzed crime scene reports, mapped the locations and times of the fires, and tried to build a psychological profile of the offender. They knew he was likely intelligent, organized, and probably held a deep-seated grudge against society or retail establishments. He was what they called an excitement-motivated arsonist, someone who derived a thrill, perhaps even a sexual gratification, from setting fires and watching the ensuing chaos. Among the attendees at this conference was a man named John Leonard Orr. He was a captain and veteran arson investigator for the Glendale Fire Department. He was highly respected, considered one of the best in his field. He was passionate, dedicated, and seemed to have an almost preternatural ability to understand the mind of an arsonist. He was a keen contributor at the conference, offering insights, suggesting theories, and helping to profile the very man they were all hunting. No one in that room could have possibly imagined the truth that the man helping them build the profile was, in fact, the man himself. John Orr was the Pillow Pyro. John Orr lived a life of staggering hypocrisy. By day, he was the dedicated public servant, investigating arsons, comforting victims, and training new firefighters. He was a family man, married with children, living a seemingly normal suburban life. But hidden beneath this veneer was a compulsive and prolific firestarter. His career as an arson investigator wasn't just a cover, it was an integral part of his pathology. It gave him a front-row seat to the destruction he created. He could return to the scenes of his own crimes, this time as a hero and expert, the man in charge. He would walk through the charred ruins, meticulously documenting the damage he himself had wrought, pontificating on the subtle clues the arsonist had left behind. It was the ultimate act of ego, a godlike complex where he was both the creator of chaos and the bringer of order. The investigation into the serial arsonist continued for years, growing colder with each new fire. The break in the case finally came not from a brilliant piece of detective work, but from a simple, crucial piece of physical evidence. At the scene of a craft store fire in Tulare County, investigators recovered a partial, latent fingerprint from one of the incendiary devices. It was a long shot, but it was their only real lead. They ran the print through state and federal databases, but got no hits. The print was then entered into a new, burgeoning database managed by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms (ATF), which collected prints of all law enforcement personnel who attended training conferences, including the one in Fresno. In March of 1991, they got a match. The print belonged to Glendale Fire Captain John Orr. The initial reaction among investigators was disbelief. It had to be a mistake. John Orr was one of them. He was a respected expert. He was dedicated to stopping arson, not starting it. Some investigators who knew him personally refused to believe it. But the evidence was undeniable. They began a covert investigation, re-examining every fire he had ever investigated, tracking his movements, and building a secret case against him. The more they dug, the more a horrifying pattern emerged. They discovered that a suspicious number of fires had occurred in towns shortly after or had visited for conferences or training seminars. When he traveled, fires seemed to follow in his wake. They compiled a list of dozens of fires that correlated with his presence. They placed a tracking device on his car and began surveillance. They watched him, waiting for him to slip up. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when investigators obtained a warrant to search his home. There, they found a trove of incriminating evidence. They found videotapes of news reports about fires he had set. They found newspaper clippings. They found maps with pins marking the locations of arsons. And most damning of all, they found the manuscript of a novel he was writing. The novel was titled Points of Origin. It was a thinly veiled autobiography, a fictionalized account of the life of an arsonist who was also a firefighter. The protagonist, named Aaron, shared Orr's initials. The details in the book were chillingly specific. It described the incendiary device, the cigarette, the matches, the rubber band in precise detail. It described the thrill of setting fires in crowded stores. It even described the Olds Home Center fire, recounting the event from the arsonist's perspective with a level of detail that only the killer could know. The book was not just a piece of fiction, it was a confession, a boastful, narcissistic recounting of his secret life. For John Orr, setting the fires wasn't enough. He needed to document his genius, to create a permanent record of his crimes, even if it was disguised as fiction. On December 4, 1991, John Orr was arrested. The news sent shockwaves through the law enforcement and firefighting communities in Southern California. His colleagues were stunned, grappling with the betrayal of a man they had trusted and admired. The man they thought was their ally in the fight against arson was, in fact, their greatest enemy. Orr's legal battle was complex, unfolding in two separate trials. The first was a federal trial in 1992 focusing on a series of non-fatal arsons in the Fresno area. The prosecution presented the fingerprint evidence, the tracking data, and excerpts from his novel. Orr, ever the performer, maintained his innocence, claiming he was being framed. He argued that as an arson investigator, it was his job to study arsons and that his novel was simply the product of his research. But the jury was not convinced. He was found guilty of 3 counts of arson and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The second trial, a state trial in 1998, was for the much more serious crime, the 4 murders at the Olds Home Center. This case was more circumstantial, but the prosecution built a powerful narrative. They presented an expert witness who testified that the fire at Olds was deliberately set and that it mirrored the fires or had been convicted of starting. They presented the manuscript 4 Points of Origin as a confession. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when the prosecutor read a passage from Orr's novel describing the fire, a passage that seemed to revel in the destruction and chaos. John Orr, representing himself for part of the trial, put on a theatrical defense. He was arrogant, condescending, and seemed to enjoy the spotlight. He cross-examined his former colleagues, trying to portray himself as a victim of a conspiracy. But his narcissism ultimately worked against him. The jury saw through the performance. On June 25, 1998, they found him guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 20 counts of arson. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of John Orr is a chilling study in duality and deception. He is considered one of the most prolific and destructive arsonists of the 20th century, suspected of setting nearly 2,000 fires over a decade, causing tens of millions of dollars in damages and taking 4 innocent lives. He was not a man lashing out in a moment of rage, but a cold, calculating predator who weaponized his knowledge and position of trust. He hid in plain sight, a wolf in firefighter's clothing. His legacy is one of profound betrayal, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we would never suspect, the ones who wear a hero's uniform while secretly fanning the flames. Case 4, the Our Lady of the Angels School Fire. Our final story takes us to a place that should be the epitome of safety and innocence, a school. We return to the Midwest, to Chicago, on a cold, gray afternoon, Monday, December 1st, 1958. The school is Our Lady of the Angels, a large Roman Catholic elementary school on the city's west side. It is a formidable brick and stone building, a cornerstone of its working-class, predominantly Italian and Irish-American neighborhood. Like thousands of parochial schools across the country, it is a place of discipline, faith, and learning. On this day, just weeks before Christmas, the school is filled with the sounds of childhood, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of lessons, the restless energy of children waiting for the final bell. Approximately 1,600 students, from kindergarten to 8th grade, are inside. The school building was constructed in 1910 with an annex added in 1939. By the standards of 1958, it was considered a sturdy, well-built structure. But it was also a product of its time, constructed before modern fire codes were rigorously enforced. Its interior was a tinderbox of highly combustible materials. The floors were coated with layers of flammable wax. The stairwells were open, made of wood. The walls were covered with decades of paint and varnish. The building had no automatic fire alarm connected to the fire department, no smoke detectors, and no sprinkler system. It was, in essence, a disaster waiting for a spark. That spark came shortly after 2 p.m. It started small, in a cardboard trash barrel at the bottom of a rear stairwell in the older north wing of the school. The source of the ignition has never been definitively proven, but the most widely accepted theory points to a student, a troubled boy, who flicked a lit cigarette into the barrel. For a critical period of time, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, the fire smoldered unnoticed in the basement stairwell. It fed on the discarded papers, wax milk cartons, and other refuse, slowly building in intensity. The stairwell acted like a flue. The fire found a source of fresh oxygen and began to climb. Superheated gases and colorless, odorless carbon monoxide, the silent killer in most fires, rose up the stairs, pooling at the ceiling of the second floor. The smoke was still light, almost invisible, and did not immediately trigger alarm. On the second floor, the classrooms were filled with children, their backs to the hallway, focused on their lessons, completely unaware of the lethal environment gathering just outside their doors. The only separation between the classrooms and the hallway was a thin wooden door with a glass transom window above it. The first person to smell smoke was the school's janitor. He went to the basement but found nothing. By the time he returned to the first floor, the fire had already established itself. Around 2:30 p.m., a teacher on the second floor, noticing the smoke seeping under her door, opened it to a wall of heat and impenetrable blackness. The hallway had become a furnace. The superheated gases at the ceiling had reached their ignition point, and the entire corridor erupted in a flashover. The fire, now a raging inferno, blew out the glass transom windows above the classroom doors, allowing the flames and toxic smoke to pour into the rooms. Panic erupted. The school's local fire alarm was finally pulled. It sounded a frantic, belated warning, but it only rang inside the school. It did not automatically alert the fire department. Precious minutes were lost as someone from the rectory next door had to run to call them. On the second floor of the north wing, the situation was catastrophic. The hallway, the primary escape route, was impassable. The heat was so intense it melted the crucifixes on the walls. The 6 classrooms in this wing were now death traps. The teachers and nuns, in an act of incredible bravery, tried to keep the children calm, instructing them to lie on the floor where the air was clearer. They herded them to the windows, their only hope for escape. The scene outside the school devolved into one of controlled chaos and absolute horror. The Chicago Fire Department responded quickly once the call came in, but they were initially sent to the wrong address, the rectory, not the school itself. This small delay cost more time. When they arrived, they were confronted with a scene from a nightmare. The second-story windows were filled with the terrified faces of children screaming for help. Smoke and flames were billowing from the building. The firefighters' initial efforts were hampered. The school was surrounded by a high, wrought iron fence, delaying the placement of ladders. They raised their ladders to the windows, and a desperate, heroic rescue operation began. Firefighters climbed into the smoke-filled rooms, grabbing children and passing them down. Priests from the rectory and frantic parents who had rushed to the scene joined the effort, forming human chains, creating makeshift slides from ladders, doing anything they could to save the children. But they couldn't get to everyone in time. The fire was too fast, the smoke too thick. Some children, their clothes and hair on fire, panicked and jumped from the second-story windows, a 25-foot drop to the concrete below. Others were pulled from the windows already dead or dying from smoke inhalation. The nuns in the classrooms refused to leave their students. Many were found dead, huddled with groups of children, their bodies shielding them in a final, futile act of protection. The fire was brought under control in about an hour, but the toll was devastating. 92 children and 3 nuns were dead. The city of Chicago and the entire nation was plunged into a state of profound shock and grief. The images from that day of firefighters carrying limp, small bodies from the blackened shell of the school, of rows of white caskets at mass funerals, were seared into the public consciousness. The investigation that followed was meticulous and soul-searching. The Chicago Fire Department determined the fire was of suspicious origin, pointing to arson. The focus eventually narrowed to a single suspect, a 10-year-old fifth-grade student at the school. He was a boy with a history of setting fires, known for being a troubled child. He reportedly confessed to a priest and later to investigators that he had started the fire, though he later recanted his confession. Due to his age and the legal standards of the time, he was never publicly named or prosecuted. He was sent to a psychiatric institution and later lived his life in obscurity. The case officially remains unsolved, a lingering question mark over an unbearable tragedy. But the question of who started the fire, while important, was ultimately secondary to the question of why so many died. The investigation laid bare a catastrophic series of systemic failures. The school, while grandfathered in under old laws, was a fire trap. The lack of sprinklers, the combustible materials, the open stairwells, the delayed alarm all contributed to the massive loss of life. The Our Lady of the Angels fire became a watershed moment for fire safety in the United States, particularly in schools. It sparked a wave of outrage and reform. In the months that followed, fire safety inspections were conducted on tens of thousands of schools across the country. An estimated 95% of them were found to have serious fire code violations. The tragedy spurred sweeping changes to fire codes nationwide. Enclosed stairwells, automatic fire alarms connected to fire departments, and in many cases, sprinkler systems became mandatory in schools. The glass transom windows, which had allowed the fire to spread so easily into the classrooms, were largely eliminated. The legacy of Our Lady of the Angels is a somber and powerful one. It is a story not of malice in the same vein as our other cases, but of a catastrophic intersection between a single, reckless act and a tragically unsafe environment. It is a testament to the bravery of the teachers, nuns, and firefighters who faced an unimaginable horror. And it stands as a permanent, painful reminder that the most stringent safety regulations are often written in the ashes of tragedy. The 95 lives lost that day were not in vain. Their sacrifice led to changes that have undoubtedly saved countless other children in the decades since. The fire at Our Lady of the Angels was an annihilation of innocence, a profound loss that forced a nation to reevaluate its most fundamental responsibility, to keep its children safe. We have walked through the smoke and ruins of 4 distinct tragedies. From the jealous rage in the Bronx to the homophobic hatred in New Orleans, from the cold, narcissistic ambition of a firefighter in California to the catastrophic carelessness in a Chicago school. Each fire was started by a human hand, but the flames were fanned by different winds: passion, prejudice, ego, and neglect. These stories remind us that fire is more than a chemical reaction. In the wrong hands, it is a tool of absolute destruction, an act that erases not just lives and buildings, but the very sense of safety we take for granted. The fury of the fire starter leaves behind more than just ash. It leaves a void, a scar on communities, and a lingering question in the quiet of the night about the darkness that can reside within the human heart. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. We hope you can find some peace in the silence that follows. Sleep well.